Pounced. Were Soldier Warriors, Book 2. Written by Kim Dillon. Narrated by Nikki Kwiatkowski. Chapter 1. The bush pilot that the WHO representative had found for her was a lanky older man with enormous white eyebrows, a wandering eye, and an accent that Marnie Arbinger could only describe as New York French. He doesn't have the best reputation in the world, her WHO contact had said with a wince, but he'll get you where you are going. Just, maybe ignore most of what comes out of his mouth. Marnie had smiled dimly at the man, even as a part of her wanted to remind him that at the beginning and at the end of it, she was doing him a favor. "This the big-time doc, eh?" said the bush pilot with a sneer. "God, if they made most docs as pretty as you, I'd get my physicals more often, wouldn't I?" "Not really that kind of doctor," Marnie muttered. "Not unless you are gravely ill." The truth was that despite her medical credentials, Marnie hadn't been in the field since the first hectic days of her residency. Her focus had always been on lab work and research. The blood that she studied provided in clean and sterile tubules and slides rather than in people. The work was rewarding and important, but sometime in the last few years, she had realized that it was not enough. Far from it. At the age of 27, Marnie was already well respected in her field, doing important work in her CDC lab and developing a reputation for the kind of insights that made all the difference when it came to hematology and the associated sciences. However, she was also growing increasingly frustrated with the bureaucracy that held her back and with the increasingly rote nature of her research. She needed something more, and it was as if her friend Jessica had zeroed in on that. As much as Jessica had always said that she envied Marnie's bright blonde hair and sky blue eyes, there was no denying the fact that Jessica herself was the one who always received the attention wherever they went. On Jessica's last night stateside, there were plenty of men at the bar, where they'd gone after the restaurant, eyeing her as if she was a piece of steak. Jessica, her bright eyes blazing, had ignored them as she gestured with her drink, her voice intent. "I'm serious, Marnie," she said. "You are way too good to waste away in a lab. I know you are doing important work there, but there's a great deal to learn on the ground as well. There's so much out there that we don't understand. That's why my next assignment's deep in the African jungle. Honestly, you could be on the next flight out if you wanted. The WHO needs boots on the ground out there." "I'm really a lot more comfortable in my lab," Marnie began, but Jessica cut her off with a snort. "Go ahead and use that city mouse demeanor on your colleagues that think that they know you. But for heaven's sake, don't try it with me." Marnie blushed as Jessica continued. "You're tough. You're also young, healthy, adaptable. I know that you hiked chunks of the Appalachian Trail while you were actually in med school." "I thought it was relaxing," Marnie said with a shrug, and Jessica shook her head. "Normal people who want to relax watch Netflix and order takeout. The fact that you took on walking through treacherous wilderness to relax your brain says something. Look, I know that you love your work and that blood is kind of your life. I just think that there are better ways to serve the cause. Get out of the lab. Get on the ground and learn more about the people that you are so dedicated to helping." The conversation had moved on to other things at that point, but Marnie could feel Jessica's words echoing through her mind. Jessica was always a convincing person, had been since they were children together. But this was more than that. It was more as if Jessica had given voice to something that had been echoing inside Marnie for a long time. The next day she had gone to her lab, realized that most of her work could be handled by people far less skilled than herself, and put in her notice. From there, it had been a real whirlwind, finding Jessica's contacts at the WHO and getting involved with their efforts in Tanzania, where Jessica had ended up. There was a distressing time where it seemed as if Jessica had disappeared off the grid, but then she had reappeared, working in a remote Tanzania medical center under a Dr. Stephanie Carter. Communication had been sparse, but the message that Marnie had received several months ago had been blunt and to the point. Please come. All medical help needed. All of that had led to a round of intense inoculations, an expedited passport, several briefings from WHO officials, and finally, a plane trip with an older man who seemed to think that he was far more charming than he actually was. Marnie gritted her teeth when he made yet another comment about how such a pretty lady should have a good man. She smiled politely when he mentioned past girlfriends who looked just like her, and somehow she didn't lose her temper entirely when he put his hands on her shoulders, rubbing away a non-existent stiffness. She had always been shyer than Jessica, the friend who hung back, but when she was as irritated as she was now, she had no qualms about defending herself. Still, he didn't do anything completely egregious until they stopped for refueling at a small village in the middle of nowhere. So, I think you know that it's a real mission of mercy, me making these runs for the WHO. He said to her as she was trying to give a young boy some money for a soda. Behind them, the plane was getting fueled up, and Marnie could see the eye rolls from the local maintenance men as the bush pilot talked. If you think that you're not getting adequately compensated, I suggest you take it up with your contact. I'm technically on loan to the World Health Organization myself. Marnie said, her tone frostily polite. Oh, you know, it's not much in the grand scheme of things, the man said expansively. It's just that a man likes to feel appreciated, you know? Especially if he's taking all this time, all this trouble, to get a cute little thing like you out to the middle of nowhere. A place like that can make a girl lonely, you know? Might be a long time before she sees a hunk of man that can give her a proper looking after. Marnie was ready to give him another polite letdown, but then he had the nerve to wrap his arms around her from behind, rocking against her in what he likely thought was a charming way. He was still murmuring some damn thing about comfort and the pleasures of civilization, when Marnie calmly raised her foot and found his shin with her heel, as she had been taught. Her foot slammed down on his with the strength and precision of a kicking mule, and the bush pilot let out a satisfying shriek as he pulled away, cursing. You bloody bitch, you broke my foot! First, bloody is right. I'm carrying on my person no less than 24 vials of some of the downright nastiest blood-borne diseases known to man, for comparison at my destination. Want to know how very bad for you it would be if you had broken one and gotten a sample all over you as you were feeling me up? I mean, I'm inoculated to hell and back, but you? She waited until she had seen the understanding dawn in his eyes, and she nodded. And as to breaking your foot, no, I didn't, but I could have. So maybe when the plane gets refueled, you can take me where I want to go, collect the money that you agreed upon from the WHO, and from here on out, let's do that with a total lack of sexual harassment. That won a tight, humiliated nod from the pilot as he limped off, and Marnie was startled to hear a good-natured laugh and whistle from one of the African women nearby. She realized with a slight blush that the woman had seen everything, and she waved back, shyly. Well, if nothing else, her time in Tanzania was going to be interesting. Chapter 2. The bush pilot put her off the plane as if she were weapons-grade uranium, along with the supplies that he had brought for the camp. Dr. Carter, an imposing woman in her early 30s, raised an eyebrow at his departure. Whatever you did to make that man shut the hell up, I'm impressed, she drawled. Marnie could feel her natural shyness awaken in the presence of the camp doctor. But before she could stick both feet squarely in her mouth, a woman wearing the khaki-green Tanzanian nurse's attire approached Dr. Carter. The woman said a few words in what Marnie recognized as Chaga, one of the several local languages spoken outside of the main cities. But she did not have enough of the vocabulary to understand it. She did not need to understand it, however, to read the fear and urgency in the woman's voice. She watched as Dr. Carter looked first upset, then wearily resigned. "I'm afraid that we don't have any time for you to get settled in, Dr. Arbinger," she said. "You're needed stat." Marnie was escorted to a series of large tents set up as operating chambers. They were sealed as thoroughly as they could be to better the chances of those being treated, but they were a far cry from the pristine operating centers that Marnie was accustomed to. The moment she was within the confines of the operating tent, she noticed two things. The first was that the scent of blood saturated the space, and the second was that it was her friend Jessica who was trying to save the man's life. Jessica barely looked up as Marnie came up next to her. Instead, Marnie observed in fascinated horror as her best friend slowly lost the patient that she was operating upon. The old man had once been very large, but some disease had wasted him away quickly. A stained cloth covered him to the waist, but Marnie saw that he had lost weight rapidly, and his skin was covered in thick boils, some pierced and deflated and others dark and round. The boils were clustered everywhere, but they were focused on his armpits and close to his throat, preventing him from breathing. No, keep breathing," Jessica murmured, her voice raw and ragged. "Please, keep breathing." Marnie assisted her friend for the next 3 hours, winning the man back to life time after time. Each breath grew shallower, however, and the space between them grew longer. Finally, even Jessica's talented hands had no more magic to impart, and the man took his last breath. For a moment, Marnie was afraid that her friend would collapse, but there was something different about the Jessica that stood before her. Jessica had always been strong, but now there was something ferocious about her. She knew what her cause was, and she had found a strength deep inside herself. "Welcome to hell," Jessica said bleakly. She drew her friend out of the tent, and after they both stripped off the contaminated gloves and gowns, she gave Marnie a deep hug. "What the hell have I gotten into here?" Marnie wondered, half desperate. "I left a safe life and job for—" Then Jessica smiled at her, a small thing, but there was hope in it that helped quell Marnie's doubt. "You have no idea how much you're needed here," Jessica sighed. "This illness, whatever the hell it is, has already devastated 2 villages that I've seen. This man is the first one struck down from another village nearby." "Good," Marnie said, and she ignored Jessica's startled look. "That means that there's a lot he can teach us. Is there a mobile lab set up for me?" "There is," Jessica said, her words hesitant, and Marnie nodded. "Good. I've got a sample kit in my bag here, and I'll start by taking what I need from the poor man we just lost. Jessica, make sure that that lab is functional for what I need. I think you know what to look for." If Jessica was shocked by her friend's authoritative reaction to the human tragedy, she recovered quickly. A brief smile crossed her face, and she nodded. "Glad to have you on board, Dr. Arbinger," she said, and she left to do as Marnie requested. Marnie took a deep breath, slid on a pair of gloves and a sterile gown for the operating room, and went back in. The man on the table was a human, one who had loved and hated, cried and laughed, but right now, Marnie couldn't allow herself to see that. Right now, he was possibly an essential piece of a puzzle that needed solving, a piece that might allow others to be spared the same fate that he had suffered. Despite her resolve, Marnie looked down at the man with some compassion, her hand stilled on her needle. "Sorry, sir. I hope to make sure that this never happens to anyone else." She took her samples as quickly as she could while still being painstakingly thorough. How long had it been since she had had to do this in the field? How long had it been since she had had to remember that the samples that she used came from real people, many of whom suffered dreadfully before they passed? When she was done, Marnie covered the man with a white cloth, closing the operating room behind her. This was a medical camp, which meant that there were people here who would know what needed to be done with the man's body. She had her own job to do. Marnie found her laboratory trailer set up exactly as she hoped it would be. It was a small piece of the familiar, in a world where the trees towered over the edge of the camp and where the plains seemed to go on forever. She found equipment that she was used to working with, and she set to it with a steely determination. The next few hours dissolved away as Marnie sunk herself into her work. There had been no work done on this disease before, not at the level where she was used to operating, so she started from the beginning. Her field was a tug-of-war between precise action and waiting. But Marnie didn't leave the samples alone while she waited. Instead, she wrote down everything she could think of that she had observed during surgery, everything that trickled through her mind. One never knew where a breakthrough was going to come from. When she finally had samples that she could look at closely, Marnie scowled. It should have been impossible. The last time she had seen samples like this, it was from a historical textbook. The blood samples were presenting like a course of illnesses that had last appeared almost 1,000 years ago, perhaps even earlier. This had all the hallmarks of what her ancestors might have called a medieval plague. But why should such a thing appear again? How would it even have survived? Marnie knew that her preliminary results were too simple to provide any real information yet. She set up a secondary round of tests, one that would need all evening to tabulate. She stretched, feeling her back crack a little, and left the laboratory tent. The African twilight was a lilac gray, suffusing the air with a soft glow that Marnie had never seen anywhere else. The camp, spread out over perhaps a Chicago city block, hummed with quieting activity, and Marnie found the quartermaster who showed her where to get her rations and the small tent where she would be sleeping. Once her hunger was sated, she asked around for Jessica, only to receive a shrug. She's where she always is, waiting. Puzzled, Marnie pressed for more information. She was finally directed to a large flat rock on the eastern edge of camp, the side that faced the harsh grasslands. She was warned, not so jokingly, to watch out for lions and hyenas. For some reason, that more than anything told her brain that she was not simply on a camping trip in the United States, and she resolved to remember that. The rock that had been pointed out to her was tall, sticking up from the ground like some sort of ancient sentinel. Against the fading light, Marnie could see Jessica's slight form seated on top. Jessica's back was perfectly straight, and she stared off over the grassland as if she were waiting for something. It wasn't an easy climb to the top of the rock to join Jessica, and by the time Marnie got to the top, she had scraped up her palms and was breathing hard. "You could have lent a hand," Marnie said, sitting next to her friend, trying to catch her breath. "Honestly, it was too much fun watching you climb up here," Jessica said with a grin. Marnie glared at her and then gave it up. No one could ever be mad at Jessica for too long. Her friend had a kind of mischievous joy to her that made it feel like you were all part of the fun. Jessica slung an arm over Marnie's shoulder, pulling her close. "God, I'm glad you're here." "Me too," Marnie said. "You've needed a proper hematologist out here for..." "Well, because of that, but for more than that. I've missed you a ton. It's so easy to get turned around out here." Marnie cocked an eyebrow at her friend. "I could see that already. But is there something else? You seem different, and as difficult as this clearly is, and as heartbreaking, I don't think that that's all there is to the story." Jessica drew her breath slightly roughly, and for a moment Marnie thought she would clam up. Jessica did that sometimes, when she didn't want to share what was inside her, even if you could tell that it was eating her up. "It's not. Marnie, you are definitely going to laugh, but I met someone." The confession felt almost painful, and for a moment Marnie was frozen. Jessica had always been among the most fiercely ambitious of their class, the one who had charged ahead and never thought about anything as simple or plebeian as companionship or marriage. In many ways, Marnie, who had always felt the wistful affection for home and hearth, had envied that resolve. Now, even in the dim twilight, she could tell that Jessica was blushing, and to her surprise, her friend looked miserable. "Oh, honey," she said, hugging Jessica tightly. "You don't look as happy as you should be with that." "I wish it were as uncomplicated as him being married or something like that," Jessica confessed. God, I don't even know where to start." "Start at the beginning, go on through the middle, and then be assured that I will still be your friend at the end. How does that sound? Also, there's nothing uncomplicated about dating a married man. I did that once by accident, and, yeah, never again. If I can't run a background check on a guy, I'm not even meeting him for coffee." Jessica laughed a little at Marnie's words. Where Jessica had always been fiercely independent, some of Marnie's own dating exploits had been the subject of teasing and fun back in the day. Marnie was a little stung by some of the comments of her fellow students at the time. But these days, she thought that they had been more on target than not. Romance had very little place when you were trying to save lives. All right. So to start at the beginning, I guess it all started when I was trying to find transport to this camp. I think you remember when I fell out of communication?" Marnie did, and Jessica was poised to continue when suddenly she stiffened. "There!" she said, pointing across the plain, and Marnie followed her pointing finger to see two figures on horseback materializing out of the gloom. That was a little strange. It was almost like she sensed them before she saw them. Marnie thought, but she didn't have much time to ponder the thought. Jessica was scrambling down from the rock. Her friend was in such a hurry that Marnie was certain she had scraped the heck out of her hands and knees on her way down. But Jessica didn't seem to care. Jessica, usually so very calm and collected, was now sprinting across the open grass towards the two men on horseback, and Marnie was following along, wondering what in the world came next. Chapter 3. A dozen thoughts ran through Marnie's mind as she followed Jessica across the grassland. It did not occur to her to leave her friend to fate, but it did occur to her to wonder what in the world was going to become of the two of them. Who the hell had she met out here? Who could she have possibly met while she was on an aid mission? Who made her look up from her work long enough to acknowledge that she had needs beyond what the WHO accounted for? At first, Marnie thought it was a trick of the fading light. The two men who were cantering towards them looked enormous. It had to be an optical illusion of perspective. Then they came closer still, and with a start, she realized that it was no trick. The two men mounted on horseback were abnormally tall and broad, and Marnie felt a thrill of apprehension run up and down her spine. One sat on his horse with effortless expertise, but the other... Marnie quickly realized that the second man, the one whose horse lagged, was not well. He was conscious, he had to be, as he held the reins in his hands, but she could tell from his posture, from the way he rocked back and forth with each motion of the horse underneath him, that he was hurt. She turned to Jessica, but Jessica only had eyes for the man in the lead. Marnie almost attempted to gain her friend's attention, but she had to do a double take. The look on Jessica's face was a strange one. Anger and longing, and something sorrowful. It pained Marnie to see the mix of all those emotions there. There was something going on here that she could not understand. But what was far more important to her at that moment was the injured man. Jessica was greeting the man in the lead with words that sounded harsh even to Marnie, but Marnie's attention was already drawn to the second man. In the dim light, she noticed that he was dressed for hard travel and that he was a white man, but his wounds quickly commanded her attention. "Hey there, sunshine," he slurred, and she realized that he must have been delirious. "All right, looks like you need help," she said, almost to herself. She glanced at Jessica and, with a burst of irritation, saw that her friend was currently in what looked like a very deep, very intense, if not heated, conversation with the other rider. Neither of them looked very concerned that this man was hurt, possibly in great pain, but Marnie knew that she did not have the time to take them to task. She needed to act, and to act fast, and after a moment, she sighed. "Sorry, sir. This is not going to be fun for either of us," she said. The horse, a narrow-faced, leggy animal, blinked at her, and she grimaced at it. "And it's not going to be fun for you either," she said. The saddle was Western, which meant that at least she got stirrups, and with a grunt she pulled herself up into the saddle with the man. She was lucky because just as she did so, the reins trailed from his hands and he slumped forward against her back. If Marnie hadn't been there to break his fall, he would have tumbled straight down to the ground. As it was, Marnie needed another 2 arms, or more, to handle the horse and to keep the man steady. But she managed to click the horse forward. "When you two are done doing whatever the hell it is you are doing, get to camp," she snapped at Jessica and the other newcomer. "This man needs help." The two broke off from their now furious argument to look at her with wide eyes, but before she had passed them entirely, they were back at it. Marnie's mind was occupied with keeping the man slumped against her back steady and thinking ahead to what he might need, but she spared a thought for her friend. Jessica had never acted like that before. It was so out of character for her to think that fighting with someone should take precedence over aiding a patient. What in the world was going on? The mysteries didn't end there. Dr. Carter was the first to meet her directly outside of camp, and when she saw the man slumped over Marnie's back, she didn't bat an eye. There was something about her that seemed to expect all of this, and she called for 2 men from camp, telling them to get Marnie and her guests to one of the quiet trailers. The 2 men helped Marnie get her charged to one of the trailers set up for medical aid, and to her relief, they heaved him off the horse and straight onto the simple bed inside. They left quickly without a word, however, and she wondered if it was her imagination or if they really did look over their shoulders at the unconscious man with fearful expressions. It had been a while since her residency, but Marnie found that this work was like riding a bicycle. Once mastered, no matter how long she'd been away, her hands could do this work while she was sleeping. It was just another night in the ER, patching up some man who had been unlucky. He might have stumbled while working at a wood bench, or he might have badly misjudged his prowess in a fight. But either way, he had been unlucky. As she hurried her way through her sanitation procedure, Marnie took a moment to hope that this man's lack of luck would not prove fatal. She used her shears to clip away the shreds of his bloodied shirt, and in an absent way, she realized that his blood was all over her back, caking as it dried. There was a strange intimacy to that stirred something inside her, but right now was not the time to figure it out. With the shirt out of the way, she could now look at the extent of his injuries, and they were extensive. There were ragged wounds dug into the man's broad chest, some shallow and some deep. They were not made by a knife or even a machete, but instead she realized that the ragged wounds must have been the work of a bite. It made no sense, though, because she had seen wounds of this sort, and these weren't just wounds made by a frightened or enraged animal. Instead, these were meant to create a prolonged and painful death, It was as if something with the ferocity of an animal and the cruel intellect of a human being combined had attacked this man. Marnie worked with the single-minded intensity of a battlefield surgeon. Her attention was focused on stopping the flow of blood and repairing the tissue to the best of her ability. At some point, she realized that there was a third mystery to be solved. "How are you healing so quickly?" she asked behind her mask. The wounds were fresh, but here and there, at some places, she could see and feel evidence of healing. Tissue and cartilage had knit together to create a maze of flesh that seemed far more healed than it should have been. However, instead of helping her in her work to heal this man, it had made it worse. Bone and flesh had healed inappropriately, creating a situation that had staunched the worst of the bleeding, but had deformed the flesh around it. The man's superhuman ability to heal himself was now working against him, as his body sought to fix itself without regard for what the fix would do. Soon, Marnie found that she was fighting his body even as she was fighting the wounds that had been dealt to him. When the man started to wake up to struggle, she hurriedly filled a syringe with the most powerful sedative she had, praying that it would work. When she felt his muscles relax, she took a shaky breath of relief and got back to work. Marnie had walked off a plane straight into an intense operation in which the patient had been lost. She had gone from there to the laboratory trailer, and then after a break of just a few hours, she found herself performing solo surgery on a man who should not exist. It was enough to make a grown woman weep, but as one of her instructors had told her, there was no crying in the operating theater. She pushed back the fear, she pushed back the worry and the wonder and the outright confusion, and instead she worked on doing what she had wanted to do her whole life. She was using her skills to save a life, and she battled for hours with death for this one man's life. At some point, hours later, she realized that she no longer felt fear or pain. Instead, despite the weariness that had sunk into her bones earlier, she felt a calm settle over her. At the bottom of it was a bedrock of certainty that this was the work that she had been prepared to do her entire life. Before her stint in the hematology labs, before medical school, before high school even, Marnie had been driven by the urge to save lives. This was the elemental heart of her profession. Twice she was certain that she had lost the man under her hands. Twice she braced herself for the ice-cold realization that the patient that she had been working so diligently to save had become one more dead body on the slab. Twice he shocked her. His pulse continued to thrum, his heart continued to beat, and she felt a surge of joy so fierce it almost made her shake. Finally, Marnie closed the wounds as best she could, her hands barely trembling at all. She had done everything she was able to do. All else would be up to the man himself. For the first time, she could take a good look at his features, and she did so now with a nearly scientific curiosity. The man was large and heavily muscled, easily topping 6.5 feet. A white man was rare in this part of Tanzania. He was deeply tanned, though she thought that at least some of that may have been his natural coloration. His face was stern, but there was a sensuality to his lips that reminded her of the marble statues of the Italian Renaissance, where male beauty was never thought to be feminine, only beautiful. "I think this is the most exquisite man that I've ever seen in my life," she thought. And the thought nearly had her looking around in shock. It was the truth, but the thought had come through so clearly, so very powerfully, that it had the force of a religious epiphany. She didn't just think that this man was beautiful. She wanted him. It was as if he'd awakened something inside her for the first time in her life. Almost hesitantly, Marnie reached up to touch a curl of hair falling over his brow. There was a scrape there, mostly healed, and she frowned at the dried blood around it. There was a mystery here, one that her scientific mind picked at. The scrape looked old, at least a few days healed. However, the blood that had dried around it was fresh. The wound would have been cleaned not long after it occurred, or at least the blood would have been wiped away, or smudged from perspiration. That hadn't happened. Judging just from the blood, the wound should still be fresh. Judging from the wound, the blood shouldn't be there at all. Marnie shook her head, feeling as if she were moving through a mire of tar. She had been up too long, and now that the adrenaline had pulled back from her system, she was left shaky and trembling. She longed for a bed, a place where she could simply lie down and withdraw from the entire confusing world for a while. But she knew that she could not leave this man unattended, not for a few hours at least. She settled in on the camp chair next to him, but it was barely 15 minutes before she could feel herself start to squirm. Marnie had thought that being as tired as she was would mean that she could sleep anywhere, but apparently that wasn't true. Despite herself, she started eyeing the table where she had been operating on the man in question. It was cleaned now, as best it could be, and there was plenty of space. Besides, he's going to be out of it for most of the day. No reason not to stretch out for just a minute. No one's ever going to know. Marnie never would have done this under other circumstances. She never would have infringed on a patient's space like that, or curled up next to someone's unconscious body. However, right now, far from home, lost and exhausted beyond her capability to imagine it, she gave in. She put away thoughts of desire and need, blood and wounds, and tried to rest. She meant to only shut her eyes for a moment, but then darkness took her with no mercy at all. In the darkest part of the jungle, the tiger stalked with grim purpose. It was a hunter, one of the finest killing machines to be birthed out of the mountains of Asia. This was not its home. This was not its preferred prey. Still, it stalked with a determination that had earned it fear throughout the world. It could scent something delicious on the wind. There was something lush and perfect ahead. For a tiger, for any animal that lived by tooth and claw, scents like that meant killing, and the part of the tiger that relished the hunt and the kill woke up, ready to conquer, ready to slay. The tiger had never been bested. It had never been beaten. If it had been, it would be dead. So it had grown used to victory, strong and even cruel. There was no mercy in its world. It was kill or be killed, eat or be eaten. It was something the tiger had understood its entire life. The smell was getting stronger, far stronger. It sunk into the tiger's consciousness, changing it in some elemental way. It was puzzling, but the tiger ignored it. The tiger was concentrated on the power of that smell, what it meant. The tiger finally came to the clearing where the prey awaited. By now, it was nearly mad with hunger and craving. But what lay beyond shocked the beast mind, pushed it back to that of the man who had lived so long with the beast. It was not a red deer or a fat pig in the clearing. No, it was a delicate human female, her skin as pale as moonlight, her eyes holding the blue of a perfect summer sky, her hair as gold as the sun itself. The tiger realized that what he felt was not hunger, but something far more powerful and compelling. This was need and desire, and he would have her, or he would die. Chapter 4. Well, hello, sunshine. At first, the words seemed to come through a dream. Marnie had heard those words before, of course. But for once, they were stated without a leer or without a kind of roughness that told her that she needed to be very careful and very wary about what was happening around her. Instead, there was a soft sensuality to those words that made her feel instantly safe. She started to burrow into the warmth that was settled next to her. And then she woke up. With her awakening came the full realization of where she was and everything that had recently transpired. Yelping, Marnie rolled off the table she was sleeping on. She would have hit the floor with a thump if a strong arm hadn't shot out and wrapped around her waist. She was pulled back onto the table in a single jerk, just one more completely bizarre thing that had happened to her in the last 24 hours. "Oh my God!" Marnie squeaked, looking up into a pair of bright green eyes. Lying comatose on an operating table, the man she had treated last night was beautiful. Eyes open and his body animated with vital life, there was something terribly striking about him as well. His body? Memory flooded through her with force, and she struggled away from him to stand next to the table. For a moment, he simply stared at her in surprise. Then he let go. She had the fleeting feeling that if he had been unwilling to let her go, she never would have gotten away. But she ignored that thought for the moment. "You shouldn't be up already," Marnie blurted out. "You're going to be recovering from your wounds for... She blinked because the sheet she had draped up to his shoulders last night was now pooling around his waist as he sat up. The wounds that had been so vivid last night were fading already. The center's still red, but the edges pink with the advanced stages of healing tissue. Marnie couldn't help but notice how broad his chest was, and how powerful his arms and shoulders, before she tugged her gaze away. "What are you?" Marnie found herself whispering. "What can heal like that? That should be impossible." There was a flash of something through his eyes, something strange and so foreign that her mind shied away from the conclusion that it was trying to draw. "I'm Jax Vanderbroek," he said. "In regards to healing, I suppose that's just living right." He said the words lightly, but there was a kind of intensity to him that made a flame alight inside her. She knew that her face was heating up and turning red, and that was before he had slipped off the table to come towards her. He still wore a pair of grimy trousers stained with blood, and they drooped low over his hips, forcing her eyes to his trim waist for a moment. He definitely was not moving like a man on death's door, and she backed away from him until she could feel her back hit one of their supply cabinets. "So, you were the one who patched me up last night," he murmured, and speculatively. Jax ran a tender finger over the curve of her cheek. There was something beautifully electric and warm about his touch, and she nearly tilted her face closer before she remembered herself. I don't know you," she managed to get out, and he gave her a smile that was white and sharp. "You will. I'm not someone who hides my desire, little sunshine. You're beautiful, the most beautiful woman that I've ever seen. Tell me your name." It came out more as an order than a request, and Marnie's mouth responded before her brain could intervene and tell her that perhaps a man this mysterious and dangerous should not know her name. I'm Marnie Arbinger, Dr. Arbinger," she said, belatedly trying to exercise some authority over the situation. "Please, I need you to sit down again so I can examine you. I need to make sure that everything went well last night." She thought, somewhere in the back of her mind that was still able to think, that his eyes were the deepest green she had ever seen, an emerald shade that put the jungle around them to shame. I'm fine, he said dismissively. My kind heals fast. What fails to kill us outright makes us stronger. No, Jax continued. I am far more interested in what a beautiful woman like you is doing so far away from the civilized world. Tell me everything about you, Dr. Marney. Again, it was a command rather than a request, and there was something inside Marnie that, despite her independence and capability, wanted to obey. Instead of giving in, however, she seized every ounce of her authority, lifted her chin, and gave him a stern look. I will not do anything of the sort, she said, and when he raised a dark eyebrow, she grabbed the first thing that came to hand. It turned out to be a basin of water, and without thinking, she shoved it at him. Here, take a bath, she babbled. It's going to be far better for you if you get clean. You'll heal better. For a moment, Jax looked profoundly stubborn, as if he had absolutely no interest in her words at all. Then a small spark of humor crept in, and he grinned. There was something about that grin that felt like a hand passed slyly between her legs, but to Marnie's relief, he took the basin from her. All right, he said, as if he were doing her an enormous favor. All right. Questions later. Marnie figured that she must have made some sound of agreement. At the very least, he allowed her to escape the operating tent, and for the moment, that was all that she cared about. Outside, dawn was just beginning to streak the camp with purple and blue. The air still held a little of the chill from the night before, but she could already feel the heat start to rise from the ground. The camp was slowly shaking itself to life, and to her relief, Marnie found the mess tent operational. She was startled when some of the other people, medical professionals and labor alike, greeted her by name and with cheerful waves. The encampment was much like a small village. She figured that word must have gotten around about who she was. Marnie was a little surprised that no one asked her about the man she had treated last night. In fact, no one acted as if it was unnatural at all, and she wondered once again what she had gotten herself into. Feeling in a mood for quiet, Marnie finished her food quickly and then took a muffin from the pile of stale pastries that were on offer. It would have been the smart thing to go hide out in her tent and try to get a few more hours of sleep. But right now, she didn't think that she wanted to be enveloped in the stuffy nylon shell. Instead, she took a shower in the camp washing facilities, put on a fresh new set of clothes, and wandered the slowly awakening camp. She found herself back at the rock where she had spotted Jessica the night before. She scrambled up on the rock, and for a few moments, she looked out over the grasslands, the jungle to her back, the sky opening up above her. She was overcome by a calm she had never felt before. She took several breaths and wondered what in the world was going to become of her, before she realized she was not alone. The man standing beside her was large enough that for a moment she thought Jax had followed her out to the rock. After a few seconds, she realized it was the other man, the one who had come in with Jax, the one who had been arguing so bitterly with Jessica. He was watching her with a slight smile on his face, and it struck her that though they only looked a little alike, mostly height and build, there was something else about this man that seemed to recall Jax. There was something dangerous about both of them. The man stood with his arms crossed over his bare chest, watching her as if he had every right in the world to do so. You were the one who tended to my companion last night, he rumbled, and she nodded. I did. He seems fine this morning. I can't explain it, and I certainly can't make heads or tails of it. but he looks as healthy as if he hadn't been slashed to ribbons last night." The man grimaced, nodding. "That must have been shocking for you," he said sympathetically. He's fine, though. It's natural for our kind." "Our kind," she echoed. "What does that mean? What's our kind? It's like you're telling me that neither of you are human." "My name is Marcus," he said instead of answering her question. "Mind if I come up there with you?" For a moment, it occurred to her to refuse, but instead she shrugged and scooted over to make space. He didn't bother with climbing up on the rock. Instead, with a single leap, he claimed the space next to her, smiling a little at her flabbergasted face. "It's a lot to take in, isn't it? I think it happens to everyone who comes out this far, who has spent most of their lives in the United States, or in Canada, or Western Europe. Things are different here, that's all. Bigger, more real somehow." Marnie could feel her temper cracking just a little. "You know, I don't believe that." "How do you mean?" "It's not the part of the world. I'm from the Midwestern parts of the United States, the place that has the greatest temperature shifts all over the world. I see the same place go from sub-zero in the winter to sometimes over 100 degrees in the summer. A friend of mine works in the Park Service in Montana, where there are plains and mountains as far as the eye can see." She met Marcus's eyes directly. He looked surprised, wary, and a bit intrigued all at once. "I don't think it's this place that is making things so strange for me. I think it's you and Jax." For a moment, Marcus froze, and then to her shock, he chuckled. "You know, she told me that you were smart, but I guess she didn't tell me what kind of smart. You know more than books, don't you?" "Who told you that?" "Jessica," he said, and when he said her best friend's name, there was a kind of warmth and longing to it that made Marnie ache. Her best friend had found a man that spoke so lovingly of her. What in the world was wrong? "Jessica was pretty angry with you last night." Marcus flinched a little at that, and a darkness crept over his expression. "It has been a difficult and trying time for both of us." He began diplomatically, but then they could both hear the grass swishing and determined, no, angry steps heading for them. "Jessica!" cried Marnie, and for a moment her mind was simply filled with happiness at seeing her friend. They still hadn't been able to catch up after being apart for months while Jessica had started her work in Tanzania. It felt good to see her this morning, like a rare pleasure, something wonderful pulled from a world of great uncertainty. Marnie slid down the rock to meet her friend, but in a moment, she could see that something was wrong. Jessica was rumpled as if she had just climbed out of bed, her clothing askew and her short black hair out of place. There was something beyond furious in her eyes, and even though Marnie knew that this was her friend, a woman she had trusted for years and years, she shrank back a little. Jessica threw her a look that was both maddened and scornful, and then she turned her eyes to Marcus. "This is where you come after you crawl out of my bed?" she snarled. "You can't wait to go sniffing around the new girl on the block?" Marcus's face darkened, and he leapt down, landing lightly close by. There was something grim on his face as well, but Marnie read there the same sadness that she had seen on Jessica's face the night before. There was more than just a lover's quarrel here, and Marnie could feel something dark hanging over them both. "You need to stay calm, Jessica," he said, his voice lowered. "There's nothing going on here. I just came out to think, and I found Marnie out here." Marnie could have told Marcus that was the worst thing that someone could say to the strong-willed Jessica. Even under the best of times, she didn't like being told what she needed to do. And this moment was no exception. Why the hell would I be calm when the man who told me he loves me only hours ago is sniffing after my so-called best friend before I've even woke up? God, is this what you do when you're out on the range with Jax? Am I simply an ego stroke? You just come back here to pride yourself that you can? Marcus made a sound that was a great deal more like a growl than Marnie would have thought could come out of a man's throat. The sound was so alarming that Marnie took a step back. Instinctively, she reached for Jessica as well. But Jessica shook her off, shaking her head with fury. "Go on, try to defend yourself," she snarled. "I shouldn't have to," Marcus roared. "I come back because I love you, and I haven't gone running after anyone. Jax came back here torn to ribbons last night. Do you even care?" "I care about the fact that you seem intent on making a fool out of me," Jessica shouted. "I care about the fact that you care so little for us, so little about what you mean to me or what I mean to you." Marcus looked as if he had reached some kind of breaking point. His face was contorted in anger, and his body was trembling in rage. For a moment, Marnie was afraid that he would do something terrible, and then he did something else entirely. The transformation was nearly instantaneous. One moment, there was an angry man looming in front of them both. The next, there was a pure black panther in his place, its ivory fangs bared in a snarl. Marnie had one moment to look at it in horror and surprise, and then it was gone, tearing off towards the jungle, leaving a sad pile of shredded clothes and a pair of boots behind. No, this is not a thing that happens. I don't care where I am, whether I'm in Cleveland or Cairo or Rio de Janeiro. I don't care. I did not just see a man just turn into a panther. She turned to Jessica pleadingly. Surely her friend would make it right. Surely Jessica could tell her what the matter was. Her best friend was still livid, however, and now all that rage, denied a target in Marcus, was turned squarely on Marnie. "Oh, I suppose you're loving this," Jessica snapped, and Marnie recoiled in hurt. "Jessica, I have no idea." "Oh, I know," Jessica said bitterly. "You have no idea. You have no clue why the boys always like you best. Why everyone seems to like you best, Little Miss Sunshine. You know, you've always been like this, and it's always made me fucking sick." Marnie's stomach rolled. She wanted to take off across the grassland herself, but she was frozen to the spot. Jessica's anger towered over both of them, drowning out the friendship that they had shared through thick and thin. "All our lives you swanned around as if butter wouldn't melt in your mouth, and why would it? You've always had protectors around. The minute you even fell and stubbed your toe, there was someone around who would pick you up and tell you it was all right, that it wasn't your fault. And now, even Marcus? That wasn't what was going on," Marnie protested frankly, spitting from the poison that Jessica was spitting at her. "He wasn't." Jessica's face crumpled, and for a moment, Marnie wondered if she had gotten through to her friend. Possibly, just possibly, if Jessica took a moment to think about what she'd actually seen, Marnie could reach her. "He's not my boyfriend," she said instead, and Marnie paused in surprise. "He's not my boyfriend, or at least, that's not what he's supposed to be," she whispered. God, what we went through in the forest, the kingdom of trees, the snake, all of it. I thought we were something amazing. Something bigger than all this petty shit. We were fate, destiny. That's what it felt like. I've never felt anything like it before. For a moment, Marnie felt a rage in her that equaled Jessica's. She wanted to find Marcus, no matter how big he was, no matter that he could turn into a panther. She wanted to maim him for hurting her friend like this. However, when she reached out to touch Jessica's arm gently, her friend jerked away. "God damn you," Jessica spat. "You've always loved seeing me like this, Miss Perfect." Before Marnie could protest how overwhelmingly unfair that was, Jessica's hand slammed against her cheek, the slap ringing across the open morning sky. The blow stung viciously, and Marnie fell backwards, her hand reaching up to touch her face. As she watched in pain and heartbreak, Jessica stalked back towards the camp. Chapter 5. Marnie knew that she could not stay on the edge of things forever. She might have wanted to, but there was work to be done. She and Jessica had been friends long before medical school. They'd met back in grade school and had become fast friends, a close friendship that had carried through to adulthood. If Marnie hadn't seen with her own eyes, she would swear the woman who'd just confronted her was not Jessica. When she crept back through camp, she felt as if everyone was watching her. This was the first time she had been able to see the camp properly in daylight, and it struck her that it was far larger than she had thought. The HWO's research camp was large, but there was also a small village adjoining it, equal in size. The people of the village spoke Chaga, and she slowly saw how many of them were employed in the research camp, taking care of logistical matters as well as providing assistance when needed. She saw a pair of women dressed in brightly colored dresses glance up at her as she passed, and she told herself that she was simply imagining them laughing behind their hands at her. This wasn't high school, and she wasn't a shunned and ostracized, gawky teenager again. "So why are you going to hide in the science lab?" asked a vicious little voice in the back of her head, and she ignored it. Life in Tanzania was terrifying. There was a kind of medieval plague rearing its head. People apparently transformed into panthers, and her best friend had turned on her. That was fine, just fine. The only thing she could depend on was her knowledge of anatomy and of blood, and that meant that she would go to a place of comfort, a place where she was useful. The laboratory trailer was exactly as she had left it, except for the man sitting on the ground inside. Jax grinned at her, washed and dressed in clean clothes. He was stunningly handsome, but Marnie was so emotionally drained that she barely reacted at all. "How did you find this place?" she asked, closing the door behind her. It occurred to her that she was shutting herself in with a man that she barely knew. But at the moment, she didn't care. "I wanted you," he said simply. "This place smelled like you far more than the tent that I bribed someone to show me to. So I waited, and here you are." There was something direct about him that warmed her. Everything around her seemed to spin, and when she reached for the test that had been ongoing since the night before, her hands were shaking. Before she could touch them, however, Jax unfolded from his seat easily, his hands coming to cover hers. "Oh my, he has beautiful hands," she thought. They were brown and lean with graceful fingers and short nails. There was something oddly sensuous about them, and she felt slightly shy when he touched her. "Are you sure you should be doing that right now?" he asked softly. "You look a little bit shaken, sunshine." His endearment, coming on the heels of Jessica's tongue lashing, made her flinch slightly. "It's all I know how to do right now," she retorted, and she pulled away. Jack subsided, watching her as she went through the motions of testing her samples and finding the results. She recorded what she had learned, but it was far from conclusive. There were a few conclusions tugging at the back of her mind, but it was still too much to put to words yet. She set her tests in motion again, and by that time she was shaking hard. Marnie barely finished her test before she sat down on the ground in the trailer, pulling her knees up to her chest and covering her face in her hands. She tried to stop herself from crying, but soon enough, it became an inevitability. Her shoulders were shaking, her chest rose in jerky breaths before collapsing into a sob, and hot tears were running down her face. She had almost forgotten that Jax was silently watching her. When he reached for her, Marnie almost resisted, but she was too far gone to resist comfort, even if she did not know the man who was offering it. She allowed him to pull her into his lap as she cried, and she took a strange amount of comfort in his soft, nonsense words of comfort. It came to her that strangely he was not speaking English. Italian? His words were soft and sweet, though, and that was all that mattered. It seemed to take an eternity, but finally her tears slowed and stuttered to a stop. "There now, love," Jack said, offering her a surprisingly clean handkerchief. "Tell me what's the matter." Marnie bit down a childish protest that everything was simply so strange and foreign in camp. Instead, she used the handkerchief to clean her face, and when Jax offered her a cup of water from the sink, she took it. He came to sit down next to her again, one arm over her shoulder, as if they had been friends for years. She thought about everything, and when she spoke, her words were measured. "Are you a werepanther?" she asked. Marnie thought that the question was quite reasonable given everything that had happened to her since she had come to Tanzania. But Jax laughed. "God, no," he said, and she shook her head in despair. "I just don't know," Marnie babbled. "I don't. It feels like everything's been turned upside down since I arrived in this place. Ups down, my best friend hates me, people transform into panthers." "Not just into panthers," Jack said. He stood, stripping his clothes off expertly, and then he was gone. In his place was an enormous tiger, sitting back on its haunches and with a smug look on its round face. Sitting up, he towered over her, and his teeth were long and looked razor sharp. The vivid orange and white and black of his coat were so bright, they seemed to bleed into the air, and Marnie reached out a hand in awe to touch, before remembering herself and yanking it back. Jax didn't seem to mind, however. Instead, he butted his head underneath her hand like every house cat she had ever met, and when she tentatively scratched him behind the ears, he rumbled ecstatically. It wasn't a purr, it was simply too loud to be one, but it calmed even as she smiled. Then, suddenly, he wasn't a tiger any longer, but man, one unashamedly naked, sitting on a pile of his own clothes with his head nearly in her lap, and her hand ruffled in his hair. Marnie yelped, and Jack sat back with a laugh, completely unconcerned with his nudity. "I thought you could use the laugh," he said guilelessly, and she laughed ruefully in response. "I suppose. Could you maybe put on your clothes? I'm not sure I am going to be able to have a conversation with, As the lady wishes," Jack said, speaking as if he were granting an enormous favor. She kept her eyes lowered as he slipped back into his clothes, but she couldn't resist a quick peek as he finished. He was strong and powerful in every way, and the wounds on his chest were well on their way to becoming a memory. When he came back to sit next to her, her expression was thoughtful. "You are not quite human, are you?" she asked, and Jack shrugged. He sat close enough that she could feel the warmth from his body, and without thinking, she nestled a little closer. Not entirely, but I'm not so far off either, he said, looking as if he had made a decision. My kind, we were once human, we think. Beyond that, well, I suppose everyone has a theory. A theory? You make it sound like something that science could understand. Don't get any bright ideas, sunshine, Jack said warningly. None of my people like the idea of being turned into science experiments in captivity. Oh, I would never, Marnie protested, suddenly aware of what she had been saying. It's just that I never knew that such a thing was possible. It defies all scientific understanding. Jack smiled at her a little. Probably just as easy to say it's magic, he suggested, and Marnie snorted. No one ever learned anything by saying it was magic, she protested. I suppose not. My kind have been around a long time. Shifters, I mean. We walk in the shadows, and we do our damnedest to keep those shadows from growing deadly. There was a darkness in his tone, and without thinking, Marnie reached out to touch his chest, where the wounds had changed to thick ropes of scar tissue. Was it one of those shadows that reached out for you yesterday? She asked, and he nodded soberly. Hyenas. They've been at war off and on with my people for quite some time now. Sometimes things get quiet. Lets us both lick our wounds. But it seems as if we can never stay away from each other's throats for very long. It's a dark thing, and it seems to be rising up again. That's why we've come, to inform Dr. Carter of what's going on, that defenses need to be mounted. She knows what she's doing, I think, but the casualties could be high. Marnie shook her head. It's all so much to take in, she said quietly. A war? People that change into animals, or animals that change into people. And all wrapped up in it is Jessica, who is someone else completely now, someone who hates me. She knew it was ridiculous to be so overwrought over something that was comparatively quite minor, but she still felt grateful when Jax threw an arm over her shoulders. Well, that I can explain at least a little, he said. The problem is that she's bonded with my friend Marcus. Problem? Echoed Marnie. If they've found each other and they love each other the way that they say they do, shouldn't that be a good thing? It's an amazing thing, said Jax immediately. Most shifters can go their entire lives without bonding. And it is love, but there's more than that. The love they share is wrapped up with fate and destiny. It may be just a good old-fashioned dose of pure instinct and pheromones. There's no take-backs and no second chances. A mate bond is for life, and it's stronger than steel. The problem is that defying a bond can really screw someone up. It may be worse for humans, I don't know. But even for shifters, it can make a person angry, depressed, sick. Well, you saw some of that, I'm sure. Marnie flinched, remembering the alien rage on Jessica's face. She wondered if it was wistful thinking, but it really did seem as if her best friend had been taken over by something beyond her control. Jax nodded as he saw that she understood. The truth is that things like this are usually resolved very quickly. They figure out that they need to stay close, at least until a child is born, and that separation from one another is painful. However, right now, Marcus and Jessica don't have much of a choice. He's needed on assignment, and she's needed here, doing what she can to keep this damned epidemic in check. They're both bound to their duties, and I guess Marcus thought they would be fine. But from the shouting that I think just about everyone in camp heard, maybe not. She looked as if she was in such torment, Marnie murmured, and to her surprise, Jax kissed her gently on the forehead. You care about your friend a great deal, he said quietly. I've always been drawn to those who put others first. Is that why you said what you did this morning? Now that he was this close, there was something intoxicating about his presence, about the way he smelled, even the way his breath ruffled her hair. Marnie could feel her heart beat a little louder, her blood run a little hotter in her veins. Almost as if he could sense her thoughts, Jax cradled her cheek in his hand. Can you feel that? He asked, his voice hushed. Marnie swallowed hard. She knew that she should have been more experienced with this sort of thing. Certainly, Jessica thought that she was. However, she knew now that there was absolutely nothing in the world that could prepare her for this man, this moment. She wanted to behave like a woman of the world, one who could answer him with a flirty wink and a laugh, but in the end, she could be no one but herself. Feel what? She asked, blushing even as she said it. Instead of being irritated or dissuaded, Jax only laughed a little. This, he said, and he kissed her. Chapter 6. Jax's kiss was like nothing that she had ever experienced. She had been kissed by men before, of course, even initiated kisses on 1 or 2 occasions. She had always thought it was pleasant enough without ever knowing for sure what everyone was going on about. Now, however, as his soft mouth slanted over hers, as his tongue caressed her lower lip, she knew exactly why some people got so excited over this simple act. His kiss was unfailingly tender. When his tongue insinuated itself between her lips, she moaned but allowed him entry. Marnie touched his tongue with hers, shyly and nervously, but the shudder that ran through his body encouraged her, gave her the ability to be bold. Without thinking, she reached for him, her hands wrapping around his shoulders. There was something perfect about the thickness of his muscles. He was poetry in motion as a man or as a tiger, and her body sang in response. Do you have any idea how delicious you are? Jax murmured. I dreamed of you, and I knew that you would be just like this, just this perfect. She started to say something in response, but then his mouth came over hers again. This time there was just the edge of aggression to his kiss. There was a beast there as well as a man, and perhaps that should have frightened her. But it did not. Instead, she felt an answering wildness come from deep inside her, and she dug her nails lightly into his shoulders. Marnie knew that her nails were sharp, but Jax reacted as if someone had taken a whip to his shoulders. He hunched over her, and she could feel his muscles moving under her hands. There was suddenly something more primal about him than there had been before, and she shivered, eyes wide. What? Did I do something wrong? Jax's laugh was more a growl than anything else, and he buried his face in her neck. When he spoke, she could feel the heat of his breath against her throat and just the hint of sharp teeth. Do that again. He growled, Please. The please was almost tacked on, but it was there, and Marnie decided that it had to count for something. Reflexively, she dug her nails into his shoulders again, making him growl. There was something satisfying about the gesture. It was almost as if she was testing him, trying to find out if he was strong enough, tough enough, and she blushed at the thought. I think I want you naked again, she whispered, and Jax purred right next to her ear, sending shivers through her body. The heat that had been pooling in her belly was spooling out to cover all of her, and if Marnie thought about it too much, She was sure that she would be overwhelmed. "My God, but you are a demanding little thing, aren't you? Put your clothes on, take them off." He shook his head with mock despair, and before Marnie could protest her innocence, he rose to stand above her. She might have been the one making the request, but she was the one who felt conquered. From his superior height, Jax looked down at her, a slight smirk on his face. "Not so far from the tiger like this," she thought absently. He had the same bright light in his green eyes, the same playful stance. "All right, the lady wants me naked." Jax had a beautiful body, and from the slightly smug look on his face, he knew it. He didn't strip for her exactly, but he took his time removing the clothes from his frame, stepping out of them with a grace that was positively feline. When he was naked in front of her, Marnie found herself gasping a little. Her eyes had immediately flown to the wounds that she had treated, but they were mostly healed now, a testament to his otherworldly powers. Beyond the scarring, however, Jax was absolutely gorgeous. His skin was bronzed without a hint of a tan line, and his shaggy brown hair had just the slightest hint of curl to it, making her want to twist her fingers through the strands. When he smiled, his teeth were white and sharp, and she licked her lips unthinking. Finally, her eyes dropped down to his erection, standing straight and proud between his legs. Almost tentatively, she reached out for it, stroking it gently with a cupped palm before taking a firmer grasp. Jax grunted when she rolled her fingers along the length, before circling the heavy head. He was silent for a few moments as she explored his body, but when her strokes became firmer, more assured, he pulled her hand back. "Don't you... Jax laughed, and there was such a sensual heat in his eyes that all of her complaints rolled away. "Another time I'll let you play as you wish," he promised her. "Right now, though, I would rather not embarrass myself like a teenage boy getting touched for the first time." Surely she could not have had such an effect on him, she thought, but then he was raising her to her feet. Clumsily, her hands reached for her clothes. She might not be able to strip as beautifully as Jax had, but she would try. Before she could so much as unfasten a button, however, Jax got there first. He took 2 great fistfuls of her shirt in his hands, and with a negligent strength, he tore it straight from her shoulders. "Oh!" Her only warning that he wasn't done was a grin that seemed far sharper than it had been before. And then he was reaching for her trousers. He knelt to take care of her shoes and socks, and with the same nonchalant strength, he ripped her bra and her panties from her as well. Instinctively, Marnie's hands came up to cover her nakedness, but Jax took her firmly by the wrists. "No," he said, his voice more a growl than it had been before. "No, not when I want to see you." "Oh, God," Marnie moaned, but she knew that she was not just blushing from embarrassment. Jax's green gaze swept over her, almost something that she could feel. Men had looked at her for most of her life, but she was not certain that anyone had ever looked at her like this, as if she was both a meal to be consumed and a territory to be protected and prized. Marnie cried out briefly as Jax crushed her to his chest. For a moment, she was acutely aware of the differences of their bodies. The hair that covered him, so rough against her smooth skin, his muscles so hard against her. But then it all dissolved into a feeling of deep heat as his mouth claimed hers again. This time his tongue claimed her with a passion that felt as if it would burn her, and she whimpered, clinging to him. His hand swept down her back to rest on her plump rear, squeezing just enough to make her squeak. beautiful as the first sunshine over the plains," he said, and she could hear the slightly ragged edge to his tone. It was hard to believe that she had provoked such a reaction in a man so gorgeous, but his member pressed against her thigh told her it was true. Marnie wasn't sure how they got back on the floor, but then they were, the tile cool against her back, the man rising hot over her. There was a part of her that cried out in shock at what she was doing, making love with a man she had met the night before. But there was something deeper inside her that knew that this was simply fated. It felt far too good to be wrong. Jax pinned her to the cool tile floor, and he explored every part of her without hesitation or shame. It was as if he could not get enough of her scent or her touch. He kissed her mouth until it felt red and swollen, and then she whimpered as he ran his tongue down the line of her throat to her breasts. She had never thought that her breasts were anything special, but there was something so careful and odd about the way that Jax touched that she could tell that he did not agree. As he palmed one gently, he suckled on the nipple of the opposite, pulling gently until it was dark and erect. Marnie had never felt herself so excited by someone playing with her breasts, and when he moved down to her belly, she had to fight a moan of disappointment. She could smell her own arousal, and that certainly meant that he could as well. Instead of nuzzling her between the legs, however, he skirted that soft and kneading area, instead choosing to work his way down to her hips and her thighs. Marnie would have thought that there was nothing much to feel there, but she was wrong again as he worked over every inch of her, kissing and caressing by turns. When he stroked the backs of her knees, she nearly yelped, but then with a firm pressure he moved the sensation from ticklish to downright sensuous. "God, I can't take much more," she whimpered, and Jax's laugh was a ragged thing. "I think that if I can take it, you can," he teased, but he shifted up, pressing her knees apart. Despite her eagerness, Marnie couldn't help shutting her eyes tightly. There was something so intimate about this, about being observed while she was twisting with pleasure. She couldn't stop herself from whimpering as he ran a gentle hand along her inner thigh, stopping just short of the humid heat between her legs. "So beautiful," he murmured. "You have absolutely nothing to be ashamed of, I swear, Marnie." She gasped when one finger pressed inside her depths. There was a moment of sting as it had been some time since she had been touched like that, but then it resolved into a sweet pressure that made her hips buck up to his touch. She expected Jax to come on top of her now, but obviously he had other ideas in mind. He eased 2 fingers inside her, but it was only to gather some of her wanting wetness, dragging it up to her clit. The moisture eased his motions there, allowing him to slide the pads of his fingers quickly and firmly against her most sensitive skin. The heat that was collecting low in her belly began to spool out as it felt as if every muscle in her body tightened. Marnie found that her body was shaking with need and desire. Her hands clenched into tight fists, and her heels pressed hard into the floor. She was shaking and groaning, and she knew that she would not be able to hold out for long. Her eyes flew open as the pleasure peaked, and she looked straight up into Jax's eyes, and then she gave herself up to the pleasure. She arched up into his hand, her entire body trembling. Somehow, at the last minute, she managed to cover her own mouth with her hand, stopping her from shouting down the laboratory trailer. "Oh God, oh my God," she whispered from behind her closed hand. Jax leaned in. "Say my name," he said intently. "I want to hear my name on your lips." "Jax," Marnie murmured obediently. Her voice hushed from her orgasm, and he growled deep in his throat. In a single motion he had pulled his hand away and come to rest on top of her. His body pressed down between her sprawled thighs, and she could feel his hard cock moving against her slippery skin. "Tell me you want me," he growled, and there was something desperate in his gaze that called to her as nothing else ever had. "Jax, I want you. God, I want you." She groaned, and struck by inspiration, she reached up and ran her nails down his back. She did it harder than she thought she would have dared, and he groaned with a desire that shook his frame. "I can't resist you," he muttered, and then he thrust, entering her with one single motion. Somewhere in the back of her mind, Marnie had wondered if she would be too sensitive or too sore after he had brought her to such an uproarious climax. Now she knew that there was only pleasure to be found in Jax's thrusts, only an echo of her own climax chasing after. He moved over her like a man determined to possess her. At first his thrusts were slow and steady, but she could feel his control pulling away with each motion. With every moment that went by, he was growing more and more frantic, his thrust sharper and harder, less controlled. "I want you, Jax," she heard herself saying. "I want you. I want you. Please don't stop. Jax." On her last repetition of his name, Jax thrust himself into her one last time, filling her with the essence of his release. His deep groan echoed in her ears, and his full weight slumped down over her. For a moment he was simply still, and then he tilted his head to one side, kissing her sweetly, as if he weren't still joined with her. "I have never known a woman like you," he said solemnly. "Have you known many women, then?" Marnie asked, trying to tease a little. She tried not to think of Jax with other women. The idea was startlingly painful. "Some," he said with a shrug, "but you leave them all behind." He pulled away from her carefully, and as she watched, he rose to go to the sink. He had spent some time in the desert, Marnie realized. He lightly dampened a cloth to clean himself, and he returned with a towel for her, but his motions were spare and careful, using only the water that they needed. There was something absurdly touching about the way he knelt to clean her, something reverent in his eyes. It was a simple act, nothing compared to the intimacy of what they had done before, but there was something profound about it. Marnie felt close to Jax in a way that she had never felt close to anyone before. Was this what Jessica and Marcus had? The bonding that Jax had spoken about? A stray thought flickered through her mind, and though she tried to dismiss it, it hovered like a worrying mosquito, looking for a way in. Jax could tell that something was wrong. She tried not to stiffen, but he was touching her face, turning her to face him. "What is it?" he asked, concern in his gaze. It occurred to her suddenly that he must feel tuned in to her emotions, even if he did not know what they signified. She thought about trying to evade him, lie perhaps, but she had the idea that he would be able to detect that too. "I think you're lying to me," she murmured. I'm afraid that you are not telling me the full truth. I don't understand how or why I can tell, but I can." The look that Jax gave her was startled at first, and then thoughtful. She wondered if he would simply dismiss her, but then he reached down to touch her face with the barest tips of his fingers. All right. But first, we should get dressed. This is not a conversation I'd like to have naked, that's for sure." Marnie turned away from him as she dressed, suddenly feeling unaccountably shy. She felt as if he had stripped her bare somehow, something that she would be feeling even after the marks he had given her had faded away. When she was dressed again, her clothes hanging slightly awkwardly as she held them together, she turned to face Jax. Fully dressed, he leaned back against the counter with what looked like a large silver chalice in his hands. From the moment she laid eyes on it, Marnie could tell that there was something unique about it, something profoundly special. Instinctively, she started to reach for it, and then she remembered herself. It didn't belong to her. It made no sense at all that she should long for it this way, but she did. "What is it?" she asked, her voice hushed, and Jack smiled a little. It was as if he sensed the reverence in her tone, understood it, and perhaps even forgave it. It is ancient, and it is powerful. That much we know for sure," he said, his voice a soft rumble. "Marcus and I retrieved it together while we were doing some excavations in Nairobi. Things are heating up there, politically speaking, and we wanted to give it a once-over before we might not be able to get back in." Marnie stared at him, scandalized. "Are you? You and Marcus are treasure hunters," she said accusingly, and he looked startled. "That's not the term that I would use for us," he said with a wince, "though I know that there are many that would be happy to call us that, and worse. At the end of the day, we're agents for the Shifter Council. We work to make sure that dangerous artifacts that originally belonged to shifters do not fall into the wrong hands." He turned the silver cup over in his hands, lost in thought for a moment. "This one? From what we can tell, it is a history fraught with tragedy. It was created very far away from here. There are records that date it back to the 1st century AD or so, and reports place it variously in Jerusalem, Rome, and what was once Carthage. It is a magical item, made by shifter hands, and at some point, it disappeared." "Who took it?" asked Marnie, enthralled by the stretch of history in front of her. She blushed when she realized that Jax likely had no better idea than she did, but he only smiled at her. "Very good question. Ownership over such items is often contested, to say the least. It disappeared, and from what we can tell, it was hidden deep. Marcus and I found it mostly by chance, and we probably wouldn't have gotten away with it if a friend of ours hadn't been around to offer us up some muscle when we were getting away." Jax shook his head. "It's a long story. Anyway, we got it, and we managed to stir up something of a hornet's nest. The hyenas that I mentioned before, there's a chance that they're on my and Marcus's tail. They'll stop at nothing to get the chalice." "So, can't you just give it to them?" asked Marnie, gazing at the silver cup again. It was beautiful and ancient, and no doubt important, but surely it wasn't worth a life. Jack smiled thinly. "Trust me, if it was just a hunk of ancient silver, I would have handed it over whistling, no matter how historically important it is. However, the legends around this beauty tell us it's something else." Marnie waited. She knew that she was being told secrets that she should not be told. Simply hearing what Jax was saying might be enough to be damning at some point down the line. However, if he would tell her, she wanted to hear. She wanted to know that he trusted her. In the end, Jax did. "It's an artifact of intense power," he said finally. "It can enhance the power of a shifter, make them stronger, faster, tougher. Legend has it that it brought victory to more than one warlord, allowing him to take over vast tracts of territory before he was stopped. The Shifter Council wants this artifact safely ensconced in their vaults, which means that it cannot fall into the wrong hands. Marnie nodded. The words that he said rang true. He was perhaps a man that was skilled at lying, but somehow she was certain he would not lie to her. "That's a lot to take in," she said softly, and he nodded. "You believe me, though," he said, and it wasn't a question. Marnie sighed a little as she nodded. "Completely." Chapter 7. Marnie set her test to run through the night, and then, feeling like a schoolgirl playing hooky, she allowed Jax to lead her out over the plain. "You're not completely healed, are you?" she asked on their walk out into the dimming savannah. Jax's pace was steady, but she could see that there was a slight pallor over his face. He grinned at her. "You are entirely too sharp for your own good, little sunshine," he teased. "Unfortunately, you are right. I'm not quite in fighting form, not yet. I wish I could heal faster, but I simply don't have it in me." "Still, it is amazing," she said, shyly reaching out to run her hand over his chest. "Wounds like that would have killed a human." "It almost killed me," he said with a casual nonchalance that she did not like. "I think the fact that I've been holding the chalice all this time may have had something to do with it." She thought about his words, and then Jax shrugged. "Or it could be that I am just that hard to kill," he said. "My kind are notoriously tough." He took her to a small deserted lean-to in the tall grass. It was likely a place where the village children played during the day, but now they had all been called home, the ones that were not stricken with the mysterious sickness. Marnie knew that she was doing everything she could to help with it, but she wasn't able to stop the brief pang of guilt. "I could be doing more," she said, and Jax tilted his head at her, looking oddly cat-like. "Can you be doing it right now?" he asked, and when she shook her head, his grin flashed sharp in the dying light. "Then you will stay here with me until you can do more," he said, and he pulled her down onto the bed of soft-cut grass under the lean-to. There was a little shelter there, not much, but it felt like a world all their own, a perfect slice of a heaven that no one had a right to expect. "There's no future or past here," Jax whispered. "Just the two of us. Let's have this pleasure in a place that is surrounded by pain." Marnie wavered for a moment, but then she gave in. She fell into his arms as if she had never lived anywhere else, and the first kiss that they shared under the broad Tanzanian sky felt like a bright comet flying through the night sky. Marnie had never felt so free in her life. She had always been a city girl, born and raised in Chicago, and then working for the CDC in Atlanta. The steel and concrete locking her safely away from the primal beat of the earth. Here, in the arms of the most exciting man that she had ever known, she could feel herself discovering the real earth, the one that she had longed for without ever knowing of it. Memories made that night would stay with her forever. She knew it. She would always remember straddling Jax's naked hips, his cock buried deep inside her as he urged her to lean back, taking in the night sky embroidered with stars. She would always remember how it felt when Jax bent her over, burying his teeth in her shoulder and marking her with a tender bruise as nothing but his. She would always remember him crying her name as if it was a prayer or a plea, a look of desperate longing in his eyes. If he was a part of her, she was a part of him, and her heart swelled with pride to be joined with this fascinating, powerful man. When they drifted off to sleep, Marnie wasn't certain whether she lay in the arms of a beautiful man or whether she slumbered against the furnace-like warmth of an enormous tiger. All she could hear as she fell into a deep and satisfying sleep was the sound of her name, half spoken, half purred. The tiger knew that there was danger coming. It was in the water. It was in the wind. Danger had never troubled the tiger before. He would kill or be killed, and that was right. Everything was as the world should be. He would run and eat while he could, and eventually there would be something that bore him down. However, things had changed, and the woman with the sunlight hair was here now. She had a spiderweb strength, delicate, but spun to hold worlds together. She was vulnerable in a way that he would never be, and it made something ache inside the tiger. He could feel her heartbeat close to him, and it felt like a frail thing, so fragile. It could be snuffed out with a single half-hearted blow of his giant paw. It could be bitten clean from the fabric of life by the jaws of a hyena. Somewhere close by, the tiger could hear the cackle of the hyena clans. They were ruthless in battle and powerful. A shiver of fear ran up his back, and he knew that there was no such thing as perfect surety. There was no way to keep his sunlight woman utterly safe, and a fear rose in him. The tiger had never known fear during his adult life. He knew that now. He had been anxious, and he had been irritated before. This fear, however, went down deep into his marrow. It was not anger, which was hot, but instead it was cold, something that could freeze him down to his fiery soul. If he had to be without this woman, he would die. He knew he could not protect her. In the dark jungle where he was born, the dark jungle that would never completely leave his heart, the tiger roared. Marnie awoke in stages. At first, there was only the knowledge that despite having slept on the ground, she was not sure that she had ever been better rested in her life. The second thing she noticed was that she was sleeping in a pair of powerful arms. She was not breathing alone. There was someone whose breathing matched hers, rising and falling with her. It was a primal comfort, and Marnie almost drifted off to sleep again. Then she became aware of a low and distant moaning, something that tugged at the edge of her consciousness. It was a sound of great pain, and to her eternal shame, for a moment, she wanted nothing more than to run away from it, to let someone else deal with the death that came with such a sound. She sat up suddenly, realizing that the sound was no dream. It was a drone of misery, and it came from the village. Next to her, Jack stirred with a frown. If he had been in his tiger form, his ears would have lain straight back against his head. "What the hell is that?" he growled. "I don't know," Marnie said, struggling into her clothes. "We have to get back. It came from the village." Before she could do much beyond stagger out from the lean-to, there was a thunder of hooves, and Marcus appeared on horseback. There was a look of stress and fear on the werepanther's face, and when he saw Marnie, he let out a breath of relief. "Marnie, get on," he growled. "You're needed." Marnie only hesitated a moment before scrambling onto the back of the horse behind Marcus. Jax emerged from the lean-to as well, scowling at Marcus. "Where the hell are you taking her?" he snarled. There was anger on his face, but there was also a fear that allowed Marnie to forgive him his possessiveness. "Back to the village. There's trouble. Get yourself together and follow. I'm not sure what we can do." On the frantic short ride back to the village, Marcus told her tersely that the disease they had been studying had broken out among the villagers in camp. There were already 3 dead, and new infections were being discovered. The toll was catastrophic on a small village, and Marnie could feel a desperate panic overtake her. She pulled it back barely, and by the time Marcus rode into the middle of camp, she was composed, if pale. The first person she saw was Dr. Carter, pale-faced and directing the medical workers and villagers in Chaga. She looked calm, but there was a terrible fear on her face. When she saw the two of them, she nodded tightly. "Jessica is tending people on the west side of the village, closest to the jungle. She needs your help, Marnie." Marcus couldn't ride through the center of camp. Instead, he dismounted and, after tethering his horse, escorted her through a scene of barely controlled chaos. Everywhere, it seemed, there were people weeping or rushing about, trying to do what they could to minister to the dead and the dying. There was one small child sitting next to a covered body, weeping loudly. It took everything Marnie had not to go to him and offer comfort. "I need to keep moving," she thought grimly. "If I can't help Jessica, that child might be joining that body on the ground." She found Jessica in one of the examination trailers, ministering to a young teenager. The teenager was nearly covered in boils, and with a chill of horror, Marnie realized that this must have all started to happen in the last 8 hours or so. My God, what kind of disease moves this fast, this ruthlessly? The incubation period must be... Jessica worked over the teenager desperately, but they could all see it when the teen took his last breath. Jessica froze, and Marnie could see the moment of realization and defeat that went over every medical professional when they realized they had lost their patient. For a moment, Jessica shook, and then she reached for the containment bags. "Come help me," she said to Marcus, and Marcus obediently came to her aid. Together they covered the teen, moving as respectfully as they could when there was such a terror waiting outside. It struck Marnie that though Jessica's tone was sharp, she wasn't as angry as she had been before. She wasn't furious with Marcus, and he wasn't as short with her. Desperate times had brought them together, and Marnie felt a strange pang of relief. When the teenager had been respectfully covered, Jessica looked up at Marnie. She seemed barely aware of the hand that Marcus placed on her shoulder. "I am glad you're here," she said, and Marnie could hear every moment of exhaustion in her friend's voice. "We've been working for 3 hours, and there's nothing we can do. Nothing we've tried works. People are simply dying." "What can I do?" Marnie asked, and Jessica's laugh was a sharp and ugly crack. "Whatever you can. Whatever you think might help. Dr. Carter's only orders right now are to keep everyone as contained as possible. Something this fast, this nasty, it could wipe out the region. Once in, no one out is going to be the rule of the day, and that goes for us too." There was something bleak and implacable about Jessica's tone, and Marnie fought down the panic that was growing deep inside her. She knew that those were the conditions necessary in an epidemic situation, and that might be exactly what they were facing now. Her skin crawled at the idea of being in a situation like this, one where she might just as easily become one of the casualties as one of the medical workers. She pushed all that fear to the back of her mind. It would not help anyone right now, least of all her. Jessica hesitated for a moment. There seemed to be a sort of silent communication that ran between her and Marcus. She nuzzled his hand without thinking about it, a gesture that struck Marnie as strangely cat-like. "I'm sorry for what happened yesterday," she said. "I was wrong. That was cruel of me. I know that it's petty in the extreme, in the face of what's happening right now. But I wanted to apologize, and I hope you can forgive me." Marnie instinctively reached for her friend, and their embrace was one of forgiveness and love. There was a desperation to it as well, but Marnie knew that it was a real hug, nothing hidden or held back. "Of course I forgive you. After this is all over, you and I are going to have a great girls' night out on the town and forget all about it." It brought a slight smile to Jessica's weary face, and she nodded. "Sounds fantastic. Now, we should get back to work." Chapter 8. The day wore on. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and during one frantic 5-minute break, Marnie thought that it should be a shame to gaze down on such suffering without so much as blinking. The village contained 76 people, and by noon, they had lost 10 of them. Another 20 were afflicted, and all the medical personnel thought that there were perhaps more that were suffering without yet coming forward about it. The word had gone out that no one was permitted to leave, but the village surprised Marnie. She was used to reading about people fleeing epidemics and unknowingly making things worse. It was common for people who were not infected to flee even their loved ones in terror. It was an innate response, if not a particularly flattering one. Here, however, no one fled. They wanted to stay close to their family and friends, and when Marnie remarked on it, Dr. Carter shrugged tiredly. "It's love," she said bluntly. "It's the love a community has for each of its members. What a mother feels for her child, what a man feels for his woman." There was a strange and distant look to her that made Marnie look twice. Stephanie Carter was a mystery to just about everyone in camp, but there was no time to tease her story out of her now. As soon as she had her breath back, it was back to work, trying to help people with few resources at her disposal and hope that dwindled with each passing moment. She could work for 2 hours on someone only to have them die. She attended to one young girl who died 4 minutes into an examination. Marnie had never felt so helpless in all her life, and all around her were the wails of the bereaved. The sound rose and fell throughout the day, but it never stopped entirely, and Marnie knew that there was nothing she could do to fight it. She was torn between breaking down into tears whenever it rose again, knowing what it signaled, or simply joining the wail with her own broken voice. She worked over the sick and dying until she thought she would shake herself to pieces, and she only looked up from her work when Jax dragged her away to stuff some food and water into her. The sight of food made her nauseated, but under his command she choked some of it down. The food sat like a lump of concrete in her belly, and she shook her head, blind with grief. "I don't know what to do," she said dully, and all he could do was take her into his arms. Then it was back to the desperate whirl of the dead and the dying, until finally night fell. It seemed as if there was an ebb in the tide of new discoveries of those afflicted, and Dr. Carter ordered Jessica and Marnie to their tents for some rest. "You're going to be in a world of hurt if you don't rest up," she said. "There are others that can take your place for a while. Get some sleep." Marnie leaned against Jessica as they staggered back to their tents. Marnie tilted her head up to look at the dimming sky. "It's so beautiful," she said, her voice hoarse. "I can't believe it's so beautiful up there, when everything down here's so ugly." Jessica wrapped her into a tight hug. "I'm so sorry I brought you here," she said. "If it wasn't for me, you'd be safely back in the States, ensconced in your sterile lab." Marnie fought back the urge to shout at Jessica, to say that she was damned right, because this was unfair and cruel. "I think I'm doing some good here," she said instead. "That's important to me." Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but then a black panther stalked out of the darkness. It said something about how exhausted Marnie was that she didn't even bat an eye. In a moment he rose up in the form of a man, and Marcus stood naked in front of them. Apparently Marnie still had enough energy to be embarrassed. She turned her eyes away, blushing a little, but Jessica had no such reservations. "What is it?" she asked, and Marcus took her by the arm. "You and Marnie and everyone else that you can find, you need to get to some kind of cover. Move everyone who can be moved to a central location, and get whatever weapons you have to protect yourselves." Marnie's brain felt overloaded. She could not handle any more information. "What's going on?" asked Jessica, an edge of wildness in her voice. It sounded as though she might lash out at any moment if she did not get more information. And at least Marnie felt a little less alone. "Hyenas," Marcus said grimly. "They're close and getting closer. They're going to attack, and they're going to leave no one alive if they're not defeated. Run. Hide." Jax appeared out of the shadows, still human, but Marnie could sense a bristling strength radiating from him. It was hard to believe that he had been on death's door such a short time ago. She reached out to touch him, and her vision spun. "No," she heard herself saying, as if from a great distance. "No, not you. You can't fight. You were wounded." "Sunshine, I must," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "If any of us are to make it out of this, to protect all these people, I have to fight." He hesitated. "I must protect you," he said more softly, and then it was as if something inside Marnie broke. She flew at him, beating at his broad chest with her ineffectual fists. "No!" she cried piteously. "You can't. I don't want to lose you, Jax. I can't." She knew that Jax had grabbed hold of her wrists, that he was holding her still and trying to soothe her, but her vision went dark around the edges. It felt suddenly as if she were seeing and hearing everything from a great distance, and then with a whoosh, everything was gone. Marnie awakened to the feeling of something blessedly cool against her brow, and the murmur of male voices. "Can't stay much longer, Jax." "I understand. Another minute and I'll be close on your tail. I promise." There was an answer that was more a growl than an assent, and when Marnie opened her eyes, she was alone with Jax. They were in one of the medical tents, and she was stretched out on one of the cots where she had so recently tended others. She felt a moment of relief when she figured out where she was, but then panic surged back up. This was where she had tended people who were dying, who were now covered with blankets and placed reverently in a covered area until arrangements could be made for their burial. She couldn't be lying there. She couldn't. Marnie froze as she sat up. Her entire body felt warm, far warmer than it should have, and her vision swam for a moment before she could see clearly. She remembered all too clearly what the translator had said when she spoke with an old woman, desperately trying to get some information out of her, something, anything, that might help her figure out how this plague could be averted. "She says she's burning up. She says something is sitting on her chest." Marnie's scientific mind knew that the woman was feverish because her body was trying to destroy the infection, and that her inability to breathe was because her lungs were having to work harder and harder. For a single moment, however, the interpreter's words made her hallucinate a demon sitting on the woman's chest, lumpy and misshapen. Marnie could feel a throbbing on her arm, and when she looked down, Her worst fears were confirmed. There was a large boil there, just above her elbow. It was the size of a quarter, round and weirdly beautiful in a way. She reached a trembling finger to touch it before she remembered herself and drew back. So this is what it feels like. She had a moment to think. The thought was very calm, almost numb, and then her heart began to beat faster. She was on the verge of panic when Jax appeared next to her. He started to say something, and then his eyes widened, looking at the boil on her arm. My God. Marnie, is that? Yes? She whispered, and tears filled her eyes. She knew that she was supposed to be strong. She had come here to help people, and now she was the one who was afflicted. It felt tremendously unfair. She was going to die. She had maybe less than a day left. Jax hesitated for only a moment, and then he gathered her in his arms. Frantically, she pushed him away, but he held on to her firmly. Pushing against him was as pointless as fighting a brick wall, and Marnie could feel her strength drained from her even as she tried. You need to let me go, she whispered, her voice little more than a pained husk. You can't be here. God only knows how this illness is transmitted. We still don't know. Jax snorted. Please. You saw how quickly I healed, didn't you? Shifter blood. It makes us immune to the nastiest of diseases. Things that kill humans. Hush. You need your strength. Marnie found his words oddly hilarious. She laughed, or at least she tried to. Her throat had started to throb abominably, and trying to make her voice work was painful. Strength for what? She managed. One of the villagers I treated this morning was almost your size. Looked like he could move a tank on his own. And he died in a matter of hours. How in the world can you think I am going to fight this off? When Jax had no answer, she gave in to her intense grief and collapsed in his arms. Even as her body was burning up, she still wanted to be close to him. It's not fair, she whispered, aware of how childish she sounded. It's just not. I came here to help others, not to. Her voice broke, and hot tears ran down her face. They felt strange on her face, and Jax wiped them away carefully with his fingers. She wanted to tell him to be careful again, but she couldn't find the strength. Not to die, Jax said quietly. You're not going to. Are you a doctor now? She asked, trying to sound tough, but she knew she had not succeeded in the least. No, I'm a tiger who loves you. I am not going to let you die. I swear to you. I've just found you. I sure as hell am not going to let you go. You've just found me? She looked up at him, and there was a ghost of a smile on his handsome face. Of course. I didn't expect to meet a woman like you. Not in all my life. And believe me, sunshine, I'm older than I look. Shifters age differently than humans, and some of us go our entire lives without finding our other half. The fact that I found mine, here, defies logic, rhyme, or reason. But now that I have found you, I am not going to lose you. What are you talking about? He sighed a little, his breath rustling her hair. I know you felt it too when we first met, he murmured. You were drawn to me, as I was drawn to you. I was gravely injured. I might have died that night if someone else was working on me. All I knew was that I saw you for that brief moment, and then there was no other option. I need you in a way that cannot be explained. We've bonded. I'm yours, forever." She felt tears slip down her cheeks again, but this time there was a tremulous happiness behind them. "Is that the truth? Not just something you're telling a poor dying woman?" "Marnie, believe me when I say that I would never lie about something as certain and as sacred as this," he retorted. "Sunshine, I love you. I am not going to let you die. This is my mission now, and my kind take nothing more seriously." Marnie felt warmed by the desire that flowed between them, and for a moment she wondered if there was truth to it. She did feel slightly stronger, but then reason reasserted itself. Jax himself might have been an immovable force, but the truth was that there were limits here, ones that her scientific mind couldn't overcome. She started to say something comforting to him, but then there was a terrible noise. It sounded as if someone had told a joke in hell, and now all the demons were laughing. "Oh God," Marnie murmured, and Jax laid her back on the bed. "They've come," Jax said starkly. "I need to join Marcus to fight them. Stay. Remember my words. You are my bonded mate now, and I would die before I let you go." He laid a soft kiss on her forehead, and then he was gone. Marnie could feel her heart longing for him the second he stepped out of the door opening. For a mad moment, she wanted to call him back. She didn't believe that he was going to fix her, not really. Everyone she had seen with these symptoms in the last 24 hours had died a horrendous death. She was going to die here, far from home and miserable, and she did not want to die alone. She knew that it would be better to spare him that, but perhaps there was some truth to his words. There was a bond between them, one that was so powerful that it shook her to the bones. Mustering all her strength, she rose from the cot. From the instant stabs of pain, she knew that there were boils on her feet now. If she took her boots off, she would never be able to walk, so she ignored them. She made it to the tent flap before she finally had to admit she could go no farther. Marnie sat down hard on the ground, panting and feeling her sweat soaking her clothes. From some cool and distant place in her mind, she knew that she was running a high fever as her body waged a hopeless war against the foreign invader. Still, Marnie found the strength to pull the tent flap aside and to peer out over the camp. She couldn't stand the idea of not knowing what was coming. The uncertainty would be inching towards dying long before the main event. The first thing she saw when she looked out of the tent was Jax. He was stripping to the skin, dropping his clothes carelessly on the ground. The setting sun gilded his body, and once again she thought of how perfect he was in every way. The idea of never being able to touch his perfect body again sent a pang of grief straight through her, and she pushed it away. There would be time to mourn when she was dead. Between one moment and the next, his shape flowed, and where there had been a man, now there was a tiger. Enormous and powerful, his vivid orange and black stripes fluorescing in the darkness. Jax looked beautiful in that moment, calm and fierce, ready to defend what was his. Marcus came up to stand shoulder to shoulder with him, a dark shadow next to Jax's own glory. For a moment, Marnie wondered where Jessica was, but then the laughter of the hyenas started up again. This time there was a menace to it that had not been there before, and she knew that they were closing in. Marnie remembered from a middle school science report she had written that while both tigers and panthers were lone hunters, hyenas traveled in troops, some more than 40 strong. She prayed that the troop that was attacking them now did not have those numbers, and then the ones in the lead entered the open area where Jax and Marcus waited for them. Marnie gasped, the air rasping hard at her throat. The hyenas were smaller than Jax and Marcus, but they were powerfully built. With their broad shoulders and thick necks, they looked like tanks built for war. And when they lunged, they seemed as quick as lightning. If the hyenas were fast, though, Jax and Marcus were faster. The moment they saw the hyenas commit to their lunges, both cats struck out in tandem. With single blows they laid out their opponents, dropping them to the ground before whirling on the ones that came after. The sounds of animal roars filled the twilight, and Marnie would have covered her ears with her hands if she had had the strength to do so. The hyenas kept up their dark cackling, and now she could hear Marcus and Jax as well. Twin tornadoes of death using tooth and claw to stem the tide of the enemy. The bodies were piled up in the clearing, and a part of her was struck by the fact that when shifters were killed, they returned to their human forms. One man fell down dead, his skull crushed by Jax's blow, and for a moment, Marnie thought she would be sick. He looked a great deal like a man she had treated earlier, and it felt wrong. It all felt so wrong. Jax roared as a hyena latched powerful jaws into his foreleg. Marnie knew that hyena jaws could crack bone, but before she could cry out, Marcus was there, slashing at the hyena with razor-sharp claws and drawing the enemy shifter off. If he dies, at least I will have a human body to mourn, she thought. That is, if I'm still alive myself. The battle felt as if it were happening in slow motion. She saw everything as if through a thick pane of glass. It was getting harder and harder to focus, to think. However, she noticed right away when there was an orange glow to the right, and when she turned to see what it was, she gasped. Jessica should have been with the medical team and the villagers, with everyone else who needed to get out of harm's way. She might have started to help with the evacuation, but apparently, she had come back, and she had come back with fire. There was a torch in her hands, an enormous length of wood with the top half wrapped in rags. From the concentrated fierce burn, it looked as if she had dipped the rag end into some sort of fuel. Jessica never hesitated. Marnie watched in awe as her scholarly best friend swung into the battle. She must have been aware that she was far smaller and far frailer than anything else on that battleground, but that never even gave her pause. Instead, she swung her torch while screaming like a banshee, thrusting the fire into one slavering face and then another. When 2 hyenas tried ganging up on Marcus, she struck out blindly at the one closest to her. It gave Marcus enough time to finish off the other, and then he turned to the one that was approaching his bonded mate, screaming the harsh and fierce scream of a big cat as he dealt with the interloper. For a moment, Marcus paused, staring into the eyes of the woman who was meant to be his. Feverishly, Marnie wondered what was going through his mind, and then he roared. The sound echoed, and in it, Marnie thought that she could hear pride and love intermingled. Jessica grinned by the light of her torch, vicious and victorious, and her blood raised by the battle, she cried out in return. This primal exchange woke a fierce envy in Marnie, and a longing that was not quelled in the least by the fever rushing through her body. This was what bonded pairs did. It was love, but it was far more than that. It was a bond forged of tooth and claw, of fire and courage. They belonged with one another, and in that moment, she longed for Jax. She did not need him there to comfort her. Instead, she wanted to protect him as fiercely as Jessica had protected Marcus. She was part of him, and he was part of her. This separation was unnatural, and it pained her. She could feel herself sliding towards unconsciousness. She fought it as best she could, even if she couldn't fight by Jax's side, the way that Jessica could with Marcus. At least she wanted to witness it. She wanted to cheer his victory or mourn his fall. However, the disease that had found itself such a welcome home in her overly warm body had no more mercy than the hyenas did. And while Marnie was still struggling, still fighting to remain conscious, darkness swirled around her and carried her off. Chapter 9. The next time Marnie opened her eyes, her entire body ached. She felt as if she had been beaten with sticks, and she couldn't help groaning. "You're up." She started a little at hearing Jax's voice, started to speak, but then there was a cup pressed to her lips, something warm and foul-tasting lapping at her lips. "Drink it all," Jax said when she started to pull away. "Please." His voice was so broken that she did as he said out of surprise. "What is it?" she croaked, and when she looked up at him, she could see him wince. "It's water, but there's a painkiller in it. It will help." She immediately felt a little better. The aches pulled back, but she also knew what that meant. For something to take effect as quickly as the foul drink had, it was made to be very strong. "You're alive," she said, too weak to be very tactful. All she could do was say exactly what she meant, and she reckoned that that wasn't such a terrible thing. Jax smiled at her, sitting on a low stool by her cot. "I am, unexpectedly. We drove off the hyenas, and I think that they will stay gone. We thinned out their numbers enough that they will think twice before attempting such a bold attack again." "I saw Jessica," Marnie murmured. "She was fighting alongside you and Marcus." "What a woman," Jax said, shaking his head. Somehow there was no jealousy in her heart when she heard him speak about another woman like that. The bond between them vibrated with strength, and she knew it was only admiration. "I can understand what Marcus sees in her, now that all her rage isn't directed at him for once." "Do you think that they'll be all right?" Marnie asked. "That is, will you watch Jessica for me?" Jax frowned at her, but she could see that he knew what she meant, even if he didn't want to admit it. "Marnie." "I mean it," Marnie said, and to her frustration, tears were beginning to prick at her eyes again. She was at a strange point where she was past grieving for herself, or even anger at what fate had inflicted. Now she was merely angry that this illness was even stealing the last scraps of vitality from her, preventing her from saying what she needed to say. Jessica is strong and capable, but there are parts of her that are soft. She needs to be protected, and I know that Marcus will do it, but maybe there are some things that he doesn't see because he loves her the way he does. I think she might need a friend, someone who stands a little apart. Jax, will you be that friend for her?" "Of course I will," Jax said slowly. "But you're her friend as well." "I'm not staying," Marnie responded bluntly. "We both know I'm not." She saw something pass over his face. Perhaps it was anger at the situation, or even at her, because she was speaking this way. It gave way quickly, however, to pure grief, and she saw his broad shoulders hitch in a sob that went through him. His strong arms went around her, pulling her close to his strong chest. The sudden motion hurt, but it hurt less than not being able to touch him, to feel his strong, healthy body against hers. She knew that there were many boils growing over her now, under her clothes, turning her skin into a wasteland. They ached when the least pressure was put on them, and she knew the time was coming soon when all would be over. "I can't lose you now," he said. "Not now, Marnie. I have just found you." No one would have said that Jack smelled good exactly. He smelled of sweat and burning grass, of blood and fur and exhaustion. However, it was a smell that was indisputably his, and Marnie buried her face in his shoulder. If she was going to drop down into the darkness forever, she wanted to be able to feel him, to experience this moment as best she could. "You're bleeding," she said, when she tilted her head back to look at him. "I'll heal," he said, and she knew that it was true. At some point, someone had gotten close enough to smash at his face. His lower lip was split. She could see that it was already beginning to heal, even if the blood was still fresh. "Am I too ugly for you now?" She knew that he was joking, and she mustered her strength and wrapped her arms around him tightly. "You're not too ugly for me," she whispered fiercely. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, completely perfect." "And all yours," he whispered, and Marnie realized that she still had some grief left despite it all. She had thought that the illness and the pain would empty her of even the ability to be grief-stricken, that she was dying. But here it came again, a fresh swelling of sadness and regret. The regret, however, had changed at some point, Marnie realized. "I'm not sorry I came to Tanzania," Marnie said softly. "I'm not at all." "Because this is such an enjoyable evening we are having?" Jax tried to joke, but she shook her head. "No. If I had never come here, I would never have met you." Her words broke something in Jax then, something that a distant part of Marnie realized had never been broken before. It seemed as a rough shiver broke over him, and then he gathered her tight in his arms again. It hurt, everything hurt. But in that moment, Marnie didn't care at all. She hugged him back with everything she had, and when he kissed her again, deeply, she gave herself up to it entirely. "I don't want to leave you. I don't want to leave you." She could hear herself chanting, but there was something far away about it. She felt as if she were watching the scene from a long distance away, her vision filmed over with something misty and strange. "Then don't," Jax sobbed. "Don't go. Don't go. Please, Marnie, stay with me. Fight for us. Fight, please." She wanted to tell him that she was fighting as hard as she could. It just didn't matter at all. She was like a little child rushing out into the ocean, beating on the rolling waves with tiny fists. There was no way she was going to be able to stem this tide, and when it rolled over her, stronger and higher with every pass, she knew that it was only a matter of time before it simply carried her away. "I love you. I love you so much," she tried to say, but Marnie was dreadfully afraid that it was going to be lost in the roar that filled her ears. It was a roaring that was so loud she wanted to bury her poor head in a pillow. Even with his enhanced hearing, Jax didn't seem bothered. That's how she knew that it was only something she could hear. "But I'm so far from the ocean," she thought, and then it ceased to matter. The black water that had been lapping at the edge of her consciousness decided that it no longer wanted to wait for her. It rose up with a decisive rush, swallowing her whole, and then she knew no more. Marnie felt no pain, and somehow she could see without opening her eyes. She felt as if she were traveling in a flightless, soundless void, and there was a part of her that found a peace that she had never considered before. There was still a part of her, however, that refused to follow that peace. It was restless, and like a swimmer fighting against the tide, it rallied. Peace was all very well and good, she supposed, but she wasn't ready for it, not yet. If she had had a mouth, she would have screamed and shouted. Instead, she simply thrashed and fought, resisting the tide that dragged her ever downward. It was remorseless, but then again, so was Marnie. She thought of Jessica, who she had known for years, and Marcus, who she was just beginning to get to know. She thought of the mystery of Dr. Carter, and then she thought of Jax. The moment Marnie thought about Jax, it felt as if someone had tossed her a lifeline. Now she could focus on the warmth of his skin, the brilliance of his bright green eyes, the strength of his male physique, and the sweetness of his kiss. Every detail came to life in her mind, made her feel more solid and more real. In some elemental way, she was anchoring herself with his memory, and that peaceful shore pulled farther away. Suddenly, there was a light, and Marnie flinched a little. How long had she been traveling in the dark? It took several long moments for her vision to adjust. And then with a start, she realized that she was on the edge of camp, the sun just beginning to rise. She could see the devastation to the outer buildings done by the hyenas, some rising smoke from a hastily doused fire. But then her attention was pulled towards a small and fragile form standing on the grasslands, gazing out at the sunrise. It was Jessica, and in that moment Marnie wondered if she had ever really just looked at her friend, just noticed her. Jessica was a beautiful woman, her face strong and determined, her fluttering, short black hair giving her a strangely gamine appeal. Here on the edge of nowhere, after a battle that was impossible to understand, she looked vulnerable and stalwart all at once. It wasn't until she saw the silver shine of tears on Jessica's face that Marnie realized with a start that her friend was mourning. Jessica cried without a sound for some timeless measure, but then a tall man padded out to meet her. It was Marcus, of course. He had obviously taken a beating during the fight. One eye was swollen almost shut, and he walked carefully, as if his ribs still pained him. However, from what Marnie knew of shifter physiology, he probably wouldn't show any signs of his mistreatment within a few days. For a long moment, he stood wordlessly behind Jessica, and then he laid a hand on her shoulder. Jessica jumped slightly, and instead of turning to face him, she dropped her cheek down to his hand to nuzzle it gently. "You'll make yourself sick if you keep crying like this," Marcus rumbled, and Jessica choked on a laugh. "How can I stop?" she demanded. "What the hell am I supposed to do at a time like this? My best friend is dead." "But I'm not dead at all," Marnie thought, strangely indignant. "I didn't know she was your best friend," Marcus said, coming up to wrap his arms around Jessica's waist from behind. She hesitated, and then Marnie felt a pang as Jessica relaxed into Marcus's embrace. There was a weary resignation on her face that Marnie had never seen before. Jessica was always the bold one, the fighter, the one who bristled with energy and would never, ever be stopped. For her to find a man who could encourage her to lean on him, well, that was something truly special. "Of course she's my best friend," Jessica said, her voice soft. "We grew up together, made it into medical school together, and believe me, we had to have each other's backs in those days. Our courses at medical school, well, they were competitive to say the least, and we were two of very few female students. The men never welcomed us. Some of the professors were asshole dinosaurs who not so privately thought that women didn't have what it took to actually be doctors. It was a nightmare sometimes. Marnie's the one who got me through it. Everyone always called me the firecracker, but she was the real powerhouse. She was the real genius, and her work after that proved it. She was brilliant and never boasted about it or made a big deal about it. She just always did her best, and she always inspired me to do my best." Marnie felt as if her heart were a piece of paper that was being ripped slowly in two. She had no idea that Jessica felt that way about her. She had always stood in awe of her best friend's mind and strength. To know that Jessica regarded her similarly touched her deeply. Why had they never talked about how they felt? While Marnie was still thinking about that, Jessica's face suddenly crumpled. Her hands rose to cover her sobs, and she sagged back against Marcus. Marnie could see that the werepanther was supporting her friend's weight, a look of deep sorrow on his face. "God, how could I have shouted at her like that? How could I have said those words to her? I was so cruel, and now I don't even understand it. It was as if I had lost all control over myself and went insane. It was like there was something whispering all this poison in my ear, and I didn't have any choice but to listen to it. Marnie would have never flirted with a guy that I was interested in. We used to go on double dates together when we had the time, and believe me, she never made me feel left out or less than she was. I know this shit. I've known it ever since we met. How could I have been so cruel?" Marcus hugged Jessica tightly, his face a mask of sorrow. "That outburst wasn't entirely your fault, not really." Jessica laughed through her tears, a sad and soggy sound. "Oh, really? And why is that?" "I hadn't thought about this until just now. I wish I had. It wouldn't have changed the final outcome, but it might have given you a few more precious hours with your friend. There are rumors among shifters that when a pair bond is very strong, every emotion gets turned up. We love harder. We feel joy more powerfully. The sensual and sexual urges are enhanced. Animal magnetism," Jessica speculated, and Marcus nodded. "Something like that. However, the negative emotions can be enhanced as well. That means that a hint of jealousy can turn into a full-on, terrible, out-of-control tornado," Jessica said, finally understanding. A little bit of irritation at a partner being gone can turn into a full-out rage. "Right. Separation is known to make it worse. When split up, bonded pairs who are normally cheerful and easygoing can turn into vultures, cruel and angry with one another. And the longer it lasts, the more intense the insanity." "So that all happened because of our separation, and not because I suddenly handed my rational mind over to raging maniacal bitch?" Marcus nodded painfully, a sad look on his face. "When you chose me, you chose a very strange path, and there are trials and tribulations as well as pleasures," he said. "I am very sorry, Jessica. I should have prepared you better. If I had, that argument might not have happened at all." Jessica turned around in Marcus's arms, going up on tiptoe, and he hunched so that she was nose to nose with him. It made Marnie ache all over again to see her friend so intimate with a man. Jessica had dated a little in college, but there was always something wary about her interactions with the opposite sex. To see her so close, so wonderfully loose and trusting with Marcus, healed something raw in Marnie's heart. If you know anything about the psychological or physiological interactions between humans and shifters, from now on, I want you to tell me. But it is good to hear that there is an explanation for what happened, and why I went off like a loose cannon. I was afraid I was losing my mind." She buried her face in Marcus's chest, and Marnie almost didn't hear it when her friend said, "I love you." The look on Marcus's face reminded Marnie of the sunshine. She knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that her friend would be protected and cared for her entire life. And something in her opened with pleasure and joy for Jessica. "I love you so much, Jessica." "Will staying close to each other prevent that reaction from happening again?" she asked, wiping her eyes a little and stepping back. "That's Jessica," Marnie thought affectionately. "No time for cuddles. Time to move on with the data gathering." Marcus smiled as if that was one of his favorite parts of Jessica as well. "Theoretically, if we stay together, we end up being more balanced and in tune. We smooth each other out. In eras past, the bond was designed to make us better hunters, though of course that only applies when both members of the bonded pair are shifters." "Don't count me out so fast," Jessica said with a tiny smile. "I thought I did pretty well with the torch last night." "You did?" Marcus said, giving her a deep kiss. "There are a few places I go where you cannot follow, but I can see about taking missions that have space for a medic, especially one as lovely as you." Jessica sighed tiredly. "I can't look that far forward," she said, breaking apart from him. "There has to be something that I can do for this village still, something that can save those that remain. Maybe afterward I can stop and think about that." Marnie realized that she could read Marcus's thoughts as clear as day. A cloud drifted over his face, and she could see him weighing the possibilities of simply pulling Jessica away, of stealing off with her into the sunrise and taking her to a place where this sickness could not possibly touch her. Then she saw him surrender the idea, instead offering her his arm as they trudged back to camp. That was good too. He knew that Jessica would put the work of saving others before her own life if she had to. To take it away would make her other than who she was, and in a way, that itself would destroy her. He understands her. That's good, Marnie thought with relief. And then she knew that she had to keep going. She couldn't wait too long, or that tugging towards the darkness would grow even more powerful. She sailed over the camp, catching fleeting impressions of pain and terror, sadness and resignation. Her soul burned with sympathetic pains, but she had to be careful not to get sucked into any of it. If she did, she might have grown stuck forever, or some other strange and dire fate. Instead, the closer she got to the medical tents, the stronger the pull was towards her own body. She sailed faster and faster until things were passing in rush of colors, and then everything went black. For a moment, Marnie wondered if it was all over. And then she realized that in the darkness she could hear voices. "I cannot let you take her from this place." The voice was Dr. Carter's, low and raspy. Though she had insisted that all of her medical team take sleep shifts, it sounded as if she had not done the same herself. She sounded as though she had worked all night. This morning, after so much grief, she was simply worn out. "And I am telling you that you cannot stop me," growled Jax. Even when he was angry, his voice was so beloved that it made Marnie want to leap into his arms. He was so close. Why couldn't she raise her arms and go to him? Why couldn't she call out to him? It took a massive effort to even open her eyes. And when she did, she was startled to see that she was surrounded by a white glow. After a moment of confusion, Marnie realized that she was looking at something that had grown very familiar to her in the past 24 hours, though certainly not from this angle. "I'm in a body bag," she thought with skin-crawling horror. "Oh my God." She could feel herself start to panic, but her body wasn't responding to her at all. She felt as if she was encased in a hollow of concrete. There was no pressure on her, but she couldn't move. She was trapped in her own body, and a creeping claustrophobia started to set in. "No," Dr. Carter said, and there was some impatience in her voice. "I suppose if you decided in all your testosterone-fueled male grief and rage that you had to pick up her poor body and throw it over your shoulder, there would be little I could do." Jax growled, a sound that would make most men shake in their boots. But Dr. Carter continued. "And you would be responsible for spreading this damn disease wherever you took her. You want to take her home? That means taking her through an international airport, Jax. That means exposing an entire traveling population to germs that might still be very viable. Where are all those people going? You're going to the United States, which, let's be honest, doesn't always move as fast as it should when it comes to epidemics. What about the people who are going to major population centers like London or Beijing? The people who are going to small rural homes where there's no professional medical help for miles? You may very well be dooming them to what is happening here, something that Marnie herself would never abide." Dr. Carter paused. Jax was quiet now, and Marnie wondered if they were done. However, when Dr. Carter continued, her voice was strangely soft, almost subdued. "I think you know, we have a friend in common." Jax made a sound of acknowledgement. He sounded almost reluctant to say anything, and Marnie paused in her struggle to understand what Carter was talking about. "He's not under anyone's control, but I think that I could convince him to see my side of things, don't you?" Jax's growl was low, but there was a note of surrender in it. "You fight dirty, Doctor," he said begrudgingly. Marnie could imagine Dr. Carter's slight and rueful smile. When she spoke, she sounded even more fatigued, and for not the first time, Marnie wondered what the woman had gone through. "That's using whatever tools I have at my disposal to keep the world safe, Jax. I swear to you, Marnie's remains will be taken care of. They will not be handled disrespectfully, and we will use them to learn what we can in order to combat this disease. I swear to you. I may not have known her that well or for that long, but I am familiar with her work. As another female in this profession, I can assure you that this is what she would have wanted." Jax sighed, giving in. I know you are right, and that is the only thing that makes the idea bearable. Thank you." "I need to leave," he said. "I can't survive this. I'm not a problem. As soon as I am packed, I'll be gone. I can't stand this." That piece of information sent a jolt through Marnie. She longed to tell him to stay. She was alive. She was fine. But she couldn't move. She listened helplessly as he left. She could still hear Dr. Carter moving around in the tent for a moment. "What the hell are we going to do?" she wondered out loud, and then she was gone too. Chapter 10. It took Marnie more than an hour before she was fully back in her body. She fought for control over every muscle she had, but as she gained more and more control, it got easier. The terrifying thought of being conscious when someone came to examine her body, with all the brutality that autopsy implied, spurred her forward. Finally, she woke up all the way, her body aching, but it was a triumphant ache. She was in full control and she struggled to free herself of the body bag. Well, it's not like they're designed to be opened from the inside, Marnie thought ruefully. She had to have a sense of humor about this, she decided. Otherwise, she might go stark raving mad. She was completely naked. Someone had likely bagged her clothes for possible contamination. There was a blanket in one of the cabinets, though, and when it was draped over her bare figure, she supposed it would cover her body well enough to get where she was going. Marnie was on her way out of the door when it occurred to her to look at her arm. The arm where that first terrible boil had appeared was perfectly clear. With a soft gasp, she looked down at the rest of her body. There wasn't a single mark on her, and Marnie's eyes widened. What happened? Had she come back from the dead? Was it a miracle? She was a woman of science. She rejected the idea of miracles, but she was still overwhelmed by what had happened. The damage to her body, to her organs. There was no way that they could have healed so quickly, so completely, but now she felt completely healthy, if sore. She shook her head. She could deal with it later. Right now, she needed to find Jax. The camp was just waking up, and from the village she could hear the renewed cries of grief. More had died in the night. Some others had discovered themselves stricken with the disease. Marnie put the thoughts of the disease outside of her head, and she ran to the trailer that had been set aside for Jax and Marcus. She knew that Marcus was likely wherever Jessica was, but she found Jax in residence. He had packed as he said he would. A small saddlebag sat at his feet. Instead of moving on, however, he simply sat on the bunk, head cradled between his hands. The door was open. She let herself in. Even then, he didn't look up. "Jax?" she said, her voice rusty. "It's me." "No, it's not," he said flatly. There was such a flat and relentless tone to his voice that she was taken aback. He didn't even raise his head to look at her. "Of course it is," she said in shock. "It's me, Jax. It's Marnie. Just look at me." Jax's laugh was harsh, and she could tell from the way his breath rasped that he had been shouting or crying, or both. "Marnie Arbinger is lying in a body bag in a trailer to the west," he said. His words dropped like bricks. "She expired from massive organ failure hours ago. She died in my arms, and Stephanie Carter had threatened to tranquilize me before I would let her go. I followed her to the place where they sealed her body away from me, and I sat with her throughout the night." He drew a deep, shaky breath, and right then, Marnie couldn't bear it any longer. She reached for him with a shaking hand. Without looking up, Jax's hand shot out, wrapping around her wrist with a punishing grip. Marnie cried out, but his grasp didn't relax at all. "Listen to me," he said, his tone deadly. He never looked at her, and Marnie felt a chill of fear. "Marnie died. I sat with her all night, and I talked with her. I talked until my voice gave out. I begged her to come back. I promised her the world if she would come back. I shouted at her, called her the worst things imaginable. She wouldn't come back for pity. She wouldn't come back for anger. Finally, I threatened the camp. I told her that if she didn't open her eyes, I would burn this godforsaken place to the ground. I would do it in a heartbeat. Marnie shuddered. Had losing her pushed Jax over the edge? Had something in him broken so completely that there was no coming back from it? It would be the most agonizing irony to lose him now. And you know what? That's when I knew that she was gone. If she wouldn't come back to save the people here, she wasn't coming back. That's how I know that you are not her. Now he did look up at her, and she gasped. His eyes were green, but they were different from the eyes that had looked at her with such love, such affection and care. Now there was something bestial in them, the human edged out by the beast. Jax had given in to something that lived inside him, and she felt a buzz of fear. This might not be something that listened to reason. If she couldn't get through to him, she had no idea what he might do. He might kill her. He might actually torch the camp as he threatened to do. By the time she would be able to get to Marcus to explain what was happening and enlist his help in stopping Jax, it might be entirely too late. Marnie knew that she had to convince him that she was indeed who she said she was. But how? All right. If I'm not Marnie, who am I? She asked, trying to stay reasonable. She could talk her way out of this, couldn't she? Jack smiled thinly at her, and it only reminded her that he was something far removed from her experience. He wasn't human, not at all. He was something far more powerful than she was, small, naked, wrapped only in a blanket. I have traveled the world, and I have seen so many things that cannot be explained. Here in Tanzania, there are many things that might choose to walk, wearing the face of a loved one. Ghost, monster, specter, apparition, what does it matter to me? Abruptly, Marnie realized that there was no way for her to convince him that she was real and alive. He knew what death smelled like. He had held her dead body in his arms. Even the most convincing words in the world could not change his mind. It was not words that told him that she was dead, after all. So how do I show him that, beyond a doubt, I am alive? The idea that came to her was risky. He was far stronger than she was. If she moved in a way that he didn't like, if she even startled him, there was a chance that he would simply snap her neck. Then she really would be dead, and there would be no arising from that, she knew. But it's the only way. She moved with a speed and strength born of desperation. She had to convince him that she was real and that she was alive. She lunged for him, and in a moment her arms were wrapped around him, and her mouth had claimed him. The kiss was hard and hot, and there was a layer of desperation over it. It was also imbued with all the love that she could offer him, all the need and desire she had for him. She could feel him stiffen under her embrace. For a moment, she thought that he was going to push her away, possibly kill her. And then his body softened against hers. His arms came up to clutch her to him, and then he was kissing her in return. His mouth was molten hot against hers, and when his tongue speared inside her mouth, she let him in gladly. It would occur to Marnie later that even she hadn't been totally sure that she was alive before that moment. It might have all been a cruel trick her mind was playing on her in an afterlife, or perhaps she really was some kind of ghost or apparition, even if she didn't know it. Oh God, Jax whispered against her lips. It's you. It's true, you are alive. Yes, she murmured, and that was all she could say before he tore the blanket from her shoulders, letting it drop to the ground, She moaned a little at her sudden nakedness, but then she was being pushed down on the bunk. Jax rose over her and she felt his hard hands running over her entire body, down her torso, up her ribs, down her arms and her legs. He was looking for boils, she realized, and after several long moments, he looked up at her, his eyes bright and sane. "It's you," he said wonderingly. "You're healed." She laughed with joy at the expression of shock and surprise on his face. "Are you finally convinced?" she asked, and he laughed. "I am now," he admitted. "I wasn't when you kissed me." Marnie blinked at him, rolling up on one elbow to raise her eyebrow. "No?" Jax looked down, and she could see the shadow of her death brush over his face. He had gone to a very dark place then, and she knew instinctively that one did not come back from such a place so easily. One couldn't. "I thought, what did it matter if you were a ghost or a monster? Even if it wasn't you, it was close enough. It might be worth having something hollow me out to wear me like a suit, or perhaps eat the tastiest bits of my organs out, if I could at least pretend I was kissing you one last time." Marnie shuddered. "That's, really romantic, Jax. I need you to promise me something. No matter what happens to me in the future, I want you to never to decide that your life isn't worth saving from monsters, all right?" Jax's laugh was deep and relieved. "All right. Now you promise me that you are never going to come down with an obscure, incurable plague again." She started to laugh in agreement, but she noticed that his split lip and bruised jaw from the battle were almost healed. Something about the droplets of dried blood that remained on his chin struck a chord in her. "Jax, how long have your people been around?" "The Italians?" She gave him a frustrated look. "Shifters." He shrugged. "A long time. Some say we began with humans, some say earlier, some say later. Our population has always been small compared to humans, but we've been there." "And you've bred true that whole time. Your shifter blood didn't breed itself out, even when faced with an overwhelmingly growing human population." "Well, calling it breeding is a little crude, isn't it?" Marnie waved him off, her mind working as fast as it could. There was a solution to this. There was a key to it, and she had it. She was so close. She was living proof that there was a cure to this plague, and she would find it. "Damn it, I have to get to my lab." Jack started to say something, and instead of listening, she just seized his wrist. She might not have been as strong as he was, but his eyes widened at her grasp, and she started to drag him out of the trailer. "Marnie, wait." "I love you, I truly do," she said. "But there's no time. This can't wait. Every second of delay means people might be dying. This plague might be going farther, spreading faster." "Marnie." God, why was he still dragging her back? "Jax, I can't wait. This can't wait, and you can't stop me." He sighed, finally coming along, but then he dropped something over her shoulders. She looked down in surprise before she realized that it was Jax's olive green field jacket. "I don't think this is the type of scientific lab work that is performed utterly naked," he said gently, and she blushed, realizing that she had left her blanket on the floor of his trailer. "All right, point made. Let's go." Chapter 11. Jack shouted explanations to the people who stared at the newly resurrected scientist storming through their midst, and Marnie paid no attention at all. She was intent on getting to her lab, where she immediately found a sample kit and pricked her finger, squeezing the drop of blood onto a slide. "All right, give me your hand." she said to Jax, and without warning she pricked him as well. Ow, what the hell? Oh, quiet, you big baby. I saw you walk around with literal holes in your chest. That was different. That was a battle wound, not one given to me by the woman who was meant to love me. Well, you love me too, so you should be fine with this. I can see that we need to talk about our different ideas of love, he said, but after that, Jax was mercifully silent. Marnie fell into her work. This was what she had been trained to do, and now her analytical mind took over. Under the powerful microscope, her blood looked normal, mostly. It certainly did not look like the blood that had been taken from the dead man who she had tried to treat with Jessica on her first day in camp. She bit her lip and looked at Jax's blood under the microscope. Yes, his blood was very similar to that of a human's. However, there were certain key differences present, she soon realized. She took some more blood from a slightly protesting Jax, spinning it in a centrifuge to get to the base components. She ran it through a half-dozen of the quickest tests she could find, and was relieved when the results came up nearly immediately. What's going on? Jax asked. I think I found it, she said triumphantly. In fact, I think you're the key to solving this. She extracted a minuscule amount of Jax's denatured blood into a syringe, and then set a drop of the infected blood on a slide. Under the microscope, she could see the results when she combined Jax's blood with that of the infected blood. It fights the attacking proteins, she breathed. It wipes them out. It's ancient enough that it's able to fight them. In English, please? Jax asked, and she turned to him, her smile wide. There's antibodies in your blood that are left over from a very ancient time. Likely it's from the same time period that this plague comes from. Humans have forgotten how to fight it, but apparently shifters have not. Jax blinked. So, not only am I immune, I'm the cure? Marnie took a deep breath. There it was. What's your blood type? O negative, Jax said. Why does that matter? Marnie started laughing. Oh, thank God, and thank you, Jax. Or rather, thank your mother and father, I guess. O negative, that's the universal donor. You can give blood to everyone in this camp. You can cure this plague. Jax blinked at her. And how much blood do I give up to this effort? Oh, stop whining, not much. Now roll up your sleeve. In an hour, she had enough of Jax's denatured blood to start treating the residents of the camp. Jessica, Marcus, and Dr. Carter had shown up, awed and slightly afraid at her seeming resurrection, but she barely spared them a glance as Jax set about proffering an explanation. Still not convinced that she's not a zombie, Jessica joked. I mean, seriously, do you know this woman? She would absolutely rise from the dead to keep working. Marnie turned to the group when she had the first course of treatments finished. She was in her element now, and Dr. Carter ceded control to her gracefully. I am going to go out and treat the most desperate patients, she said briskly. Marcus, come with me to help. Jessica, you and Dr. Carter stay here and keep working with Jax. Keep him hydrated, but get that blood. Marcus, just checking, but your blood type... A positive. All right, shame. We can't use that for donors, and we don't have the time to test. Let's go, you're with me. Marcus fell into step next to her, and when they were out of earshot of the others, he finally spoke. Do you truly think this will work? Marnie didn't falter at all. It has to, she said, and she didn't know whether it was faith or fear that drove her forward. All she knew was that she had been dead, and now she was alive. The living blood that ran through her veins was something that animated her. made her feel more vital than she had before she became sick. Perhaps there would be consequences that arose later, but the truth was, in the here and now, she was alive. She and Marcus made their way to the first med tent, and she got to work. Chapter 12. 48 hours later, Marnie, Jax, Marcus, and Jessica collapsed around a small fire that the men had built. They were some distance away from the village, and all around them the savanna twilight arose in a gorgeous display of deep indigo. Some stars were peeking out above, and when Marnie tilted her head back, she dreamily pondered the fact that they were the same stars that the ancient peoples had seen. "Dr. Carter came up with the final totals before we left the village," Jessica was saying. "Everyone we reached with the serum from Jax's blood is well on their way to healing. Some of the first ones we got to, the ones whose illness was not too severe yet, are practically healed. Some very powerful blood you have there, my friend." Jax nodded with a wry grin. "I have to say, that was the first battle I ever won by bleeding profusely. But honestly, the real victor was Marnie." Marnie grinned and snuggled a little closer to him. He was as warm as a furnace against the increasingly chilly night. "It's not over, though," Jessica said soberly. "Marnie, did you see the report that came in this evening, right before we left camp?" Marnie felt the idol of the night snap like a twig, and she sat up. "No, what did it say?" "Another village, about 100 miles north. They seem to be having the same issues. We've managed to synthesize a cure from the blood that Jax already gave, and that means that at least we won't have to keep bleeding him." "Bit of a relief," Jax commented, but Marnie ignored him, frowning. "Things are pretty set here," she mused, "but that village is going to need some help." Jessica nodded. "They are. The village is larger, and what's more terrifying, they're a trade stop to other points in the region. The capital and the WHO are working together to institute a quarantine, but the antidote needs to get there, and fast." Jessica hesitated, and for some reason she clasped hands with Marcus. She glanced up at him before continuing. "Marnie, I know that so far, your time in Africa has been unexpected. You didn't expect to get in the middle of a shifter battle. You didn't expect to die. Hell, you didn't expect me to turn into a raging queen bitch." "Didn't expect to meet Jax either," Marnie said with a soft smile, and Jessica grinned in return. "But the fact remains that this was way more than you signed on to do. It would be well within your rights to say that you are done after all this, and that you just wanted to go home. But, of course, we both know that I'm not going to do that," Marnie said immediately. "You don't even have to ask, Jessica. I'm with you." Jessica flashed her a bright and grateful smile. "I knew you would say that, but thank you, so much. This is going to make a huge difference to what we can do, how much ground we can cover. Jax and Marcus still need to deliver their artifact to the council, and their route takes them right where we need to go. They agreed to escort us along the route, so that's a good thing." Jessica's eyes darkened, and her jaw took on a resolute line that Marnie was very familiar with. Some would call her best friend stubborn as a mule, but Marnie had always thought of her simply as determined. Marcus and I made a mistake being separated for long periods during the last few months. It was a tearing pain every time we were apart, and when we were together, it hurt too, knowing that sooner or later we were going to need to be separated. I'm not doing that again." "Nor I," Marcus said. He raised their joined hands and kissed hers gently. "I was a goddamn ruin when she wasn't around." Marnie stared at him in surprise. "I thought it was just Jessica," she began, and Jax laughed. "God, no. At one point, he got so mad, he actually challenged a shifter we know to a wrestling match." That doesn't sound... Man turns into a rhino, Marcus admitted, glowering. Stop telling that story. It went poorly for Marcus, Jack said, squeezing Marnie a little closer to his side. It goes poorly for any truly bonded pairs when they are separated. Marnie laughed with Jessica, but she couldn't let go of a nagging fear for her own sake. Were she and Jax bonded? She remembered those hurried words that he had spoken when she was dying. But in all fairness, she was actually dying at the time. What did it mean now that she wasn't? Had Jax rethought it all and come to a different conclusion? What would this mean for them? Almost as if Jessica could read her best friend's mind, she stood up. Marcus and I have a private camp set up about a mile away. Should be a nice walk for us before we turn in. We can leave the fire in the shelter to you two, all right? Before they left, Jax and Marcus exchanged a glance that Marnie didn't understand. When her friends were gone, she looked up at Jax. What was that all about? She began, but then he stopped her questions with a kiss. They had kissed since she had found the cure, but the kisses had all been quick and furtive things, a small amount of pleasure found while she was working as hard as she could to keep the villagers alive. Marnie had only slept when Dr. Carter ordered her to bed, and even then, it was only for 5 hours. She should have been dead on her feet, but when Jax kissed her like this, all warmth and wonder, she could feel herself start to rally. A moment ago, she would have thought that she lacked the energy to do much more than raise her head, and now she could feel a thread of heat weave its way through her. I need you, he growled, and she whimpered a soft response. It was true. The only word for what flowed between them was need. There was no urgency, however, in the way he took her back to the shelter, where there was a thin pad over the hard ground. He lay her back on it, and when she started to reach for her clothes, he pushed her hands away gently. I want to look at you, he murmured. All of you. She bit her lip as he stripped her. Her body trembled under his touch, and she had to stop herself from reaching for him as well. Instead, she lay in front of him like a sacrifice as he ran his hands over her, touching every part of her. When his hands got intimate, she whimpered again, and Marnie saw a shudder go through his body. This man craved her, she realized, but something was holding him back. Are you worried that I'm still sick? She asked, and he looked up, startled. No, Jack said after a moment. Not at all. It's just... When I lost you, when they zipped you into that bag, it hurt so deeply. It hurt that I hadn't looked at you more when I had the chance, and that I hadn't memorized every inch of how you looked, how you laughed. She could see then the darkness that had come over him when he thought she was dead, and her heart ached. She couldn't lie still any longer. Instead, she rose to her knees and wrapped her arms around him. She could feel the shudders of fear and remembered loss that ran through him. I want to give him something else to think about, she thought, and she started to strip his clothes off. Marnie, I'm alive, she whispered. I'm alive and I'm healthy, and all I want right now is you. He groaned like a demon being released from hell. He wrapped her so tightly in his arms that she gasped, and then his mouth flew to hers. The kiss he gave her was all-encompassing, all-devouring, and then he was pushing her back onto the ground. Their naked bodies seemed to hunger for one another, and when he found the tender place at the crook of her neck, he bit. The pain spiraled through her, turning to pleasure and awaking the primal nature that her life had buried. It was too easy to forget the heart of passion and the heat of it. Too easy by far to hide how bare and raw this could be. Jax's weight on her was delicious, and she could feel the weight of his erection between them. She thought that he would press inside her then, but to her surprise, he turned her over on her belly, lifting her hips up. "Oh God, Jax," she moaned, burying her face in her hands. It struck her, what she was doing, making love to this wild, dangerously beautiful man outdoors, bent over and exposed. It wasn't shame she felt, however, but a fierce passion, as if she was reaching something that her mind had forgotten, but her body hadn't. "Such a beautiful and perfect woman," he growled. "All mine, perfectly mine." She groaned when she felt his hand stroke her most intimate parts from behind. It occurred to her that he could see all of her in this exposed pose, and then he was stroking her clit with one rough finger. She arched in surprise and pleasure, and then as her eyes fluttered closed, she realized she didn't care how she looked, or if anyone could see. The only thing that mattered was the pleasure he was giving her, how wet and hot she was growing for him. When he pressed one finger inside her warmth and then another, she blushed to realize that he was testing her. Jax would never hurt her, and so he was examining her readiness and her need for him. What he found must have pleased him because he pulled his hand away. Before Marnie could do little else beyond whine with need, he was on his knees behind her. She was not sure that she had ever felt smaller than she had right then, crouched on the ground with the tip of Jax's cock pressed to her entrance. She braced herself, holding her breath, but then she sighed as he pushed inside her. "Oh, please, please," Marnie mumbled incoherently. But Jax was not going to be rushed. His slide inside her was smooth and slow, and as he entered her, he was murmuring soft, sweet words. Not all of them were in English. Not all of them made sense. But somehow Marnie understood him. She was his, he belonged to her, and the sensations between them pulled them together. Marnie groaned when she realized that he was intent on keeping to that torturous pace. Then she realized that no matter what position she was in, she was far from helpless. If the last few days had taught her anything, there were ways to get what she needed. Experimentally, she rolled her hips back against him, and she was rewarded with a startled gasp. "Marnie?" "I don't want to be careful," she moaned, repeating the motion. "Don't you understand, Jax? You're the one I want, always, forever." She might have been worried that she had revealed too much of herself, but then he took a tighter grip on her hips. She thought for a moment it had all been for nothing, but then his control snapped. His fingers bit into her hips, and he started thrusting into her, his voice reduced to growls of need. There was something vicious about the way he was pushing inside her, but it was exactly what she needed with him in that moment. She needed the way he pressed into her, and the way his growls seemed to vibrate right through her. She needed the way each thrust seemed to drive her higher and higher. She simply needed him. And what the hell would she do when their time was over? For some reason, the mixture of grief and the unknown layered together with her need and her pleasure, and that pushed her over the edge. Her climax exploded through her with an intense amount of force, making her cry echo through the calm night air. He followed just a few thrusts later, spilling his seed inside her with a groan. She was as still as she could be while the fire coursed through her, and then they both toppled to their sides, still connected in the most intimate way possible. If she could have, she would have clung to him tightly, trying to make the beauty of the moment last as long as it could. As it was, she simply lay curled on her side, breathing and trying not to cry. "Sunshine, are you all right?" For some reason, that endearment found its way past all her defenses, and the tears flowed freely. With a soft sound, Jax freed himself from her so that he could turn her around and gaze into her face. "Sunshine, what's the matter?" he asked. "Please, tell me what's wrong." As much as she wanted to respond to him, it took Marnie several moments before she could calm herself enough to speak without hiccuping. She lay in his arms, simply letting his strength flow through her. It felt as if she might be breaking a spell by speaking, but she knew that she would have to do so at one point or another. "What's going to happen to us, Jax?" she asked, and she felt him go still. "What do you mean?" "Not tonight, or even tomorrow, or the next week when we're going to be helping at that village. But what happens after that?" "I don't know the future, Marnie," Jax said softly. "My line of work, it's dangerous sometimes. You've seen that. But what I want to say is that after I've delivered that damn chalice, and after you have done what you need to do at the next village, will you come to Naples with me?" Marnie blinked, unable to understand what it was he just said. "To Naples?" she asked. He nodded, brushing her hair from her face. In the dim light, his eyes looked nearly black, but there was such a deep intensity to them. "It's where I'm bound after my time in Africa. But it's more than that. It's where the Shifter Council is headquartered. Many of my kind live there permanently. It's a beautiful place, and once you see it, I'm sure you'll love it. The city itself is hundreds of years old, and there's a beauty there. It's like a poem made into a place where people can live." "It sounds amazing," she said, but still she hesitated. "How am I going there?" she asked him quietly. "I don't know where we stand, what we are to each other." The smile he gave her flashed white in the darkness, and she lifted her face slightly as he rubbed the ball of his thumb over her cheek. "You're my mate," he said tenderly. "My love, my heart, my only. Come with me, please." A shadow flickered across his face. "If you wish to say no, for any reason, I will of course bow to your wishes." Whatever else he was going to say was lost because she threw her arms around him hard. "Yes," she swore. "Yes, I love you. I can feel that straight down to my soul. And wherever one of us goes from now on, the other will follow." Jax rolled over on top of her, his green eyes intent. "Say it again. Tell me you love me again." She laughed joyfully, because it was a wonderful thing to say when it was true. "I love you. I love you. I am your mate," she said, and he kissed her. She knew that it was the beginning of something wild and wonderful, something perfect and free. In the arms of this man, she had discovered peace and passion, and there was no turning back now. The end. This has been Pounced, Were Soldier Warriors, Book 2. Written by Kim Dillon. Narrated by Nikki Kwiatkowski. Copyright 2018 by Lovestruck Romance. Production copyright 2018 by Kim Dillon.